Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we will walk a quiet path together. A path that leads not to a distant mountain or a hidden temple, but to a place of stillness within your own heart. We will explore the gentle art of self-forgiveness, the first and most crucial step toward finding true and lasting peace. So often, we carry the weight of our past, the echoes of mistakes that keep us from the quiet rest we seek. This story is an invitation to lay that burden down, to see that the chains we feel are ones we can unlock from the inside. It is a journey of compassion, not for others, but for the one person who needs it most, yourself. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Weight of Unseen Chains. In a small village nestled between green hills and whispering bamboo forests, there lived a potter named Kaito. He was not just a potter, he was a master, a man whose hands seemed to understand the secret language of the earth. From the time he was a boy, his fingers had known the cool, damp weight of clay, the subtle shifts in its texture, the precise moment it was ready to yield to a new form. His workshop, a simple wooden building at the edge of the village, was a place of quiet reverence. The air inside smelled of wet earth, of wood smoke from the kiln, and of the faint, clean scent of finished glazes. Sunlight streamed through the paper screens, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, golden spirits. For years, this workshop had been Kaito's sanctuary. The rhythmic turning of the potter's wheel was the beat of his own heart. The gentle pressure of his hands, shaping a formless lump of clay into a graceful bowl or a strong, elegant vase, was a form of meditation. Villagers and travelers from distant provinces would come to him, not just to buy his wares, but to watch him work. They spoke of the stillness that surrounded him, a deep, abiding peace that seemed to flow from his hands into the very clay he shaped. His creations were known for their perfect balance, their quiet beauty, and a certain life force that made them feel warm to the touch, even when empty. He was a man who had found his place in the world, his purpose held firmly and lovingly in his own two hands. But that peace was now a distant memory, a shore from which he had drifted far, far away. The workshop that was once his sanctuary had become his prison. The silence that once soothed him now felt heavy, judgmental. The potter's wheel stood still in the corner, shrouded in a thin layer of dust. The clay sat untouched in its damp cloths, waiting for hands that no longer had the confidence to shape it. Kaito was a man haunted, a man bound by unseen chains forged in the fire of a single, devastating mistake. It had happened 6 moons ago. The local lord, a man of refined taste and great influence, had commissioned a special piece from Kaito. It was to be the centerpiece of a new tea house, a large ceremonial vase that was to embody the spirit of the surrounding landscape. Kaito had spent weeks preparing. He had walked the hills, sketching the curve of the mountains in his mind. He had sat by the river, listening to its flow, wanting to capture its endless, graceful movement. He chose the finest clay, a rare, dark earth he had to travel 3 days to procure. He mixed it with his own hands, feeling for the perfect consistency, kneading out every last bubble of air, every imperfection. The work was slow and demanding. For days, he sat at his wheel, his body a perfect extension of the spinning clay. The vase grew under his touch, rising like a prayer from the earth. He gave it the gentle curve of the hills, the strong, stable base of the ancient stones in the forest, and a neck as slender as a stalk of bamboo reaching for the light. He called it the dragon's breath, for the unique, swirling glaze he planned to use, a secret recipe passed down from his master, which was said to shimmer with the colors of mist and fire when fired at precisely the right temperature. The vase was the culmination of his life's work. It held all his skill, all his devotion, all his understanding of beauty. As he placed it carefully in the kiln, a flicker of pride, sharp and unfamiliar, stirred in his heart. It was a feeling of ownership, of attachment to the outcome, a thought that whispered, "This will make my name eternal." It was a tiny crack in the perfect stillness of his concentration, a thought so small he barely noticed it. But it was enough. The firing of the kiln was a delicate ritual. Kaito tended the flames for 2 days and 2 nights, his senses attuned to the slightest change in temperature, the color of the fire, the sound of the wood crackling in the belly of the earthen oven. He did not sleep. He barely ate. His entire being was focused on this one act of transformation, turning soft clay into hard, resonant porcelain. On the 3rd morning, as the kiln began to cool, he felt a deep exhaustion settle over him. He waited, his heart a tight knot in his chest. The hours stretched into an eternity. Finally, when the kiln was cool enough to open, he unsealed the heavy stone door. He reached in, his hands protected by thick cloths, and drew out the vase. For a moment, it was perfect. The glaze had worked its magic, swirling with hues of deep indigo, soft grey, and fiery amber. It looked as if it held a living mist within it. But then, as the morning light touched its surface, he saw it. A hairline crack, running from the lip down through the shoulder of the vase. And as he watched, holding his breath, a second crack appeared, and then a third, branching out like a spider's web. A low, groaning sound came from the porcelain, and then, with a final, heart-stopping snap, the dragon's breath vase shattered in his hands. It fell to the floor in a cascade of sharp, glittering pieces. The sound was not loud. It was a quiet, final sound. But for Kaito, it was as if the sky had cracked open. The silence that followed was absolute, a void where all his hopes, all his pride, all his identity as a master potter had just been. He stood there for a long time, staring at the fragments on the dusty floor, the beautiful, ruined pieces of his masterpiece. The sunlight caught the edges of the broken glaze, making them sparkle like bitter tears. From that day forward, Kaito was a changed man. The joy he once found in his work vanished, replaced by a cold, persistent dread. He cleaned up the pieces of the broken vase, but he could not sweep away the memory. The sound of the cracking porcelain echoed in his mind, a constant, tormenting refrain. An inner voice, one he had never heard so clearly before, began to speak to him. It was a cruel, relentless critic, and it never left him alone. When he woke in the morning, before the sun had even risen, the voice was there to greet him. "Remember the dragon's breath," it would whisper. "Remember the sound of your failure." When he walked through the village and people greeted him with respect, the voice would sneer. "They don't know. They call you a master, but you are a fraud. A master would not have failed." He tried to return to his work. He would sit at his wheel, take a piece of clay, and begin to center it. But his hands, once so sure and steady, now trembled. The clay, which had always felt like a willing partner, now seemed to fight him. It would wobble off-center or slump under the pressure of his uncertain touch. The voice would be there, whispering in his ear. "Your hands have forgotten their skill. The clay feels your doubt. It knows you are no longer a master." After a few frustrating attempts, he would give up, his shoulders slumping in defeat, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. The chains that bound him were invisible to everyone else. His wife would look at him with concern, asking what was wrong. His friends would visit, encouraging him to return to his craft. They saw a man lost in sadness, but they could not see the heavy, clanking chains of regret he dragged with him everywhere he went. Each link of the chain was a memory of the mistake, the flicker of pride, the sound of the crack, the sight of the shattered pieces, the disappointed face of the Lord's messenger. These chains grew heavier with each passing day. They were forged in the heat of his self-blame and cooled by his shame. They clinked with every step he took, a constant reminder of his imperfection. At night, he would lie awake, staring into the darkness, replaying the moment of the firing over and over again. What if he had let the kiln cool for another hour? What if he had used a different mixture of clay? What if he had not allowed that single arrogant thought to enter his mind? The questions were a form of torture, a wheel of rumination that spun endlessly, offering no answers, only more pain. His sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and disturbed. He dreamed of kilns that exploded, of hands that turned to stone, of beautiful vases that crumbled to dust at his touch. He would wake with a gasp, his heart pounding, the weight of the broken porcelain sitting on his chest like a physical burden. The world outside his workshop continued its gentle rhythm. The seasons changed, the bamboo forest swayed in the wind, and the river flowed on its timeless journey to the sea. But for Kaito, time had stopped on the day the vase broke. He was trapped in that single moment, unable to move forward, unable to go back. His suffering was a closed room with no windows and no doors. He began to see his mistake not as an event that had happened, but as a reflection of his true self. The crack in the vase was a crack in his own being. The failure was not something he did, it was something he was. This belief was the heaviest chain of all. It robbed him of any hope for redemption, any possibility of peace. For how can a man forgive himself if he believes his very nature is flawed, broken beyond repair? He would sometimes stand at the door of his workshop, looking out at the world. He would see a child chasing a butterfly, a woman hanging laundry in the sun, two old men playing a game of Go under a willow tree. He saw life, simple and unburdened, and he felt a profound sense of separation, as if he were a ghost in his own life, watching the world of the living from behind an invisible wall. The wall was built of his guilt, and the mortar that held it together was his inability to forgive himself. The weight of these unseen chains was immense. It bent his back and slowed his steps. It clouded his eyes and stole the warmth from his voice. The master potter, the man who could create such profound beauty from simple earth, could find no way to mend the brokenness he felt inside. He was lost in a forest of his own making, a place of deep shadows and echoing whispers of failure. He knew he could not continue like this. The weight was becoming too much to bear. It was crushing the very life out of him. He needed help, but he did not know where to turn. How do you ask someone to help you break chains that no one else can see? How do you find a path forward when your own mind is the labyrinth in which you are lost? His anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface of his days, a quiet storm that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. He was a prisoner of his own past, and he had forgotten that he was the one holding the key. His workshop, once a place of creation and life, now felt like a mausoleum for his former self. He would sit on the worn wooden step where he had once greeted customers with a calm smile, and now he felt like a gatekeeper to a tomb. His tools, once extensions of his own hands, hung on the wall like silent accusers. The fine bamboo ribs for shaping curves, the sharp wires for cutting clay from the block, the soft sea. Sponges for smoothing surfaces. Each one seemed to hold a memory of his former confidence, a ghost of the effortless connection he once had with his craft. He would sometimes pick up a familiar tool, its wooden handle worn smooth by his own palm, and feel nothing but a hollow ache. The connection was gone. The magic had fled, leaving behind only the cold, hard fact of his failure. One afternoon, a young boy from the village, whose mother had bought many of Kaito's simple, sturdy bowls, ran up to him, holding a small, misshapen lump of mud he had found by the riverbank. "Master Kaito," the boy said, his eyes wide with innocent hope, "can you make this into a bird for me? A little sparrow?" In the past, Kaito would have laughed, taken the mud, and in a few quick, playful movements shaped a perfect little bird, delighting the child with his casual magic. But now he flinched as if struck. The innocent request felt like a mountain he could not climb. The voice in his head was instant and sharp. "A bird? You cannot even make a vase worthy of a lord. You will only disappoint him. Your hands are clumsy now. They only know how to break things." Kaito looked at the boy, his own face a mask of profound sorrow. He shook his head slowly. "I cannot," he whispered, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. "I am not making things anymore." The boy's face fell, his confusion more painful to Kaito than any anger would have been. He watched the child walk away, his small shoulders slumped, and another heavy link was forged and added to his chain. The shame of disappointing a child over something so simple. The inner critic fed on this moment, growing stronger. "See?" it hissed in the quiet of his mind. "You bring sadness to others now. Your failure is not contained. It is a poison that spreads from you into the world." It twisted everything. When his wife brought him his evening meal, her gentle touch on his shoulder was not comfort, but a sign of her pity. The voice would say, "She feels sorry for you. The great master is now a broken man who must be cared for like an invalid." The taste of the food was like ash in his mouth. His body, once strong and centered from the physical work of pottery, felt weak and brittle. A constant tension settled in his shoulders and neck, as if he were perpetually bracing for another blow, another reminder of his fall from grace. The memory of the vase was no longer just a thought. It became an assault on his senses. He would be walking by the river, and the glint of sunlight on the water would suddenly transform into the sharp, cruel sparkle of the broken glaze on his workshop floor. He would hear a dry branch snap underfoot in the forest, and the sound would morph into the sickening crack of the cooling porcelain, a sound that seemed to originate from inside his own skull. At times, he could almost feel the sharp edges of the shards in his palms, the phantom pain of his masterpiece dying in his hands. These moments would stop him in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat, the vibrant world around him fading into a grey blur of his own making. He thought of his own master, an old man with eyes that seemed to hold the quiet wisdom of the mountains themselves. Had he ever failed? Kaito searched his memory, but could not recall a single instance. His master had seemed infallible, a perfect vessel of the potter's art, a man whose hands never faltered. Kaito had strived to be just like him, to achieve that same flawless perfection. He had built his entire identity, his sense of self-worth, on this impossible ideal. Now, he saw that his pursuit of perfection was not a path to enlightenment, but a trap. He had been so focused on creating a flawless object that he had forgotten that the potter himself is made of imperfect, transient, human clay. The vase was not his only creation that day in the kiln. He had also created an identity, an ego, built around being the master. And when the vase shattered, that fragile identity shattered with it, leaving him with nothing but the sharp, painful pieces of who he thought he was. The weight of it all became a physical presence. It was a stone in his belly, a fog in his head. The joy of the world, the simple beauty he had once so easily channeled into his art, was now something he could only observe from a great distance, as if looking through thick, distorted glass. One evening, as the full moon rose over the dark silhouette of the hills, Kaito sat in his silent workshop. The moonlight streamed through the open door, painting silver stripes across the dusty floor and the shrouded potter's wheel. The loneliness was absolute. The voice of his inner critic had exhausted itself for the moment, leaving behind only a profound, aching emptiness. In that deep silence, another voice emerged. It was much quieter, almost a whisper, coming not from his mind, but from a deeper place. It did not offer solutions or accusations. It simply asked a question. Is this how it will end? The question hung in the cool night air, as clear and luminous as the moon itself. Is this the final shape of your life? A man sitting alone in the dark, haunted by a ghost made of clay. The thought of living out the rest of his days in this grey, airless prison was suddenly more terrifying than the failure itself. For the first time in months, a different feeling stirred within him, a feeling buried deep beneath the layers of guilt and shame. It was a tiny spark of will, a flicker of the life force he thought he had lost completely. He did not know what to do or where to go, but he knew, with a certainty that cut through the fog, that he could not stay here. He had to find someone, something, that could teach him how to put down this unbearable weight. He had heard tales from traveling merchants of an old Zen master who lived deep in the mountains, a man who was said to understand the nature of suffering. The journey would be long, difficult, and he did not know if the master would even see him. But the alternative, to remain here, chained to his wheel, slowly turning to dust alongside his unused clay, was no longer an option. The first step out of a prison is to realize you are in one, and in that moment of quiet desperation, Kaito finally saw the walls for what they were. They were not made of stone or wood, but of his own thoughts. And perhaps, just perhaps, what is built by the mind can also be unbuilt by the mind. With a deep, shuddering breath, he stood up, the moonlight illuminating the path from his workshop door into the unknown darkness of the world outside. Part 2. The Whispering Stream. The journey into the mountains was an act of leaving a part of himself behind. With each step Kaito took, the familiar sights of his village receded, and with them, the immediate, suffocating presence of his failure. The path was not easy. It wound its way upward, a narrow ribbon of earth and stone that clung to the side of the mountain. Ancient cedars, their bark like the wrinkled skin of old men, stood as silent witnesses to his passage. Their deep, earthy scent filled the air, a clean and ancient perfume that seemed to scrub at the dusty corners of his mind. At first, the climb was a purely physical struggle. His legs, unused to such exertion, ached with the strain. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. Yet, this physical pain was a strange kind of relief. It was simple, honest, and real. It was a sensation in his muscles, not a ghost in his head. For brief moments, the sheer effort of placing one foot in front of the other was enough to silence the relentless inner critic. The voice that whispered of his worthlessness was drowned out by the pounding of his own heart and the rasp of his own breathing. But the mind is a stubborn companion. As his body found a rhythm in the climb, his thoughts began to churn once more. He rehearsed what he would say to the master, crafting and recrafting the story of his shame. He wanted to present his suffering perfectly, to make the old man understand the depth of his despair so that he might be given a profound and immediate cure. The story of the dragon's breath vase, which he had replayed 1,000 times, became his mantra of misery. Each turn in the path, each new vista of the valley below, was lost on him. He walked through a world of breathtaking beauty, but his eyes were turned inward, fixed on the landscape of his own brokenness. After a day of walking, he spent the night in a small cave, the entrance partially hidden by a curtain of hanging moss. He built a small fire, its warmth a small comfort against the deep chill of the mountain night. As he stared into the dancing flames, he saw the kiln fire, and the memory of the cracking vase returned with a vengeance. He slept fitfully, wrapped in his thin blanket, the hard stone floor, constant reminder of his lonely pilgrimage. He rose before dawn, his body stiff and sore, and continued his ascent. The air grew thinner, cooler. The world became a place of rock, mist, and sky, and then he heard it. At first it was just a faint murmur on the edge of hearing, a sound so constant it was almost silence. But as he climbed higher, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. It was the sound of moving water. It was not the slow, meandering sound of the river in the valley, but a more energetic and complex music, a sound of life, of constant, effortless movement. Following the sound, he left the main path and pushed his way through a thicket of wild azaleas. The ground became soft and damp under his feet, and then the trees opened up, and he found himself in a small clearing. It was a place of impossible peace. A small, simple hut made of dark wood and thatch stood nestled against a large, moss-covered boulder, looking as if it had grown there. A thin curl of smoke rose from a clay pipe in its roof, but the heart of the clearing was the stream. It was not wide, but it was alive, tumbling over smooth grey stones, swirling into small, clear pools, and whispering its endless song to the ancient trees that lined its banks. The water was so clear he could see every pebble on its bed, each one worn smooth by the ceaseless flow. An old man was standing by the water's edge. He was small and wiry, with a bald head and a long white beard that reached his chest. He wore a simple, patched robe, the color of dry earth. He was not meditating or chanting sutras. He was carefully, methodically, washing a single rice bowl in the cold, clear water of the stream. He moved with a kind of unhurried grace, his attention completely absorbed in the simple task. Kaito stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart suddenly pounding for a different reason. This was him, Master Jiro. He felt a wave of apprehension. What if the master sent him away? What if his problem was too small, too mundane for such a man? He took a deep, shaky breath and stepped forward. The old man did not seem to notice him until Kaito was only a few feet away. He looked up, his eyes dark and clear, holding a stillness that seemed as deep as the pools in the stream. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a quiet, patient awareness. Kaito bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the damp earth. "Master," he began, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion, "forgive my intrusion. My name is Kaito. I was a potter." The master said nothing. He simply finished rinsing the bowl, shook the water from it, and placed it upside down on a flat rock to dry in the sun. Then he turned his full attention to Kaito. The story spilled out of Kaito, a torrent of words held back for too long. He spoke of his skill, his pride, the commission from the Lord. He described the dragon's breath vase in loving detail, its form, its glaze, its promise of perfection. Then his voice grew, thick with pain, as he recounted the firing, the sound of the crack, the sight of the shattered pieces on the floor. He told the master about the voice in his head, the unseen chains, the dusty workshop, the trembling hands, the fear that his life was over. He held nothing back. He laid the entire heavy burden of his suffering at the old man's feet, his words ending in a choked sob. He knelt in the damp moss, his shoulders shaking, utterly spent. He looked up at the master, his eyes pleading for an answer, a cure, a single word of wisdom that could make it all go away. Master Jiro listened. He listened with his whole being, his gaze never leaving Kaito's face. He did not nod or offer words of comfort. He simply received the story, his presence a vast, silent space into which Kaito could pour his pain. When Kaito finally fell silent, the only sound was the gurgling of the stream, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and Kaito's own ragged breathing. The silence stretched on. It felt to Kaito like an eternity. He began to feel foolish, exposed. Perhaps the master thought his problem was trivial. Perhaps he had no answer. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was low and calm, like the sound of a stone settling on the riverbed. "You have traveled a long way with that story," he said. "It must be very heavy." He paused, looking not at Kaito, but at the flowing water. "The stream has been speaking since the moment you arrived. Its voice is much older and wiser than mine. Go and sit by its bank, and listen to what it has to say." That was all. He gave a slight bow, turned, and walked slowly back toward his hut, leaving Kaito kneeling by the water's edge. Kaito was stunned. He felt a surge of confusion, then anger. He had climbed a mountain, poured out his heart, and this was the response? Go listen to the water? It felt like a dismissal, a mockery of his pain. He had come for wisdom, for a secret teaching, for a koan to wrestle with. He had been given a child's task. His inner critic leaped at the opportunity. He thinks you are a fool, it sneered. He is sending you away to play by the creek. Your suffering is meaningless to him. He almost stood up and left. He could be halfway down the mountain by nightfall, but where would he go? Back to his dusty workshop? Back to the sleepless nights and the heavy chains? The memory of his desperation, the quiet question that had arisen in the moonlit silence, held him there. And there was something in the master's eyes, a depth of compassion that belied his simple words. He had not been dismissed. He had been given an instruction. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he decided to try. What else was there to do? He found a large, flat rock, warmed by the afternoon sun, that jutted out over the water. He sat down, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, trying to mimic the posture of meditating monks he had seen. He closed his eyes and tried to listen. At first, all he heard was the noise in his own head. The voice was louder than ever, a furious monologue of resentment and self-pity. Listening to water, what nonsense! I need a solution, not a nature walk. The Lord has probably commissioned a new potter by now. My name is ruined in the village. He replayed his confession to the master, cringing at his own emotional display. He thought about the journey back down the mountain, the return to his empty life. His mind was a chaotic marketplace of anxious thoughts, each one shouting for his attention. The sound of the stream was just a meaningless, monotonous background hiss. He opened his eyes in frustration. This was impossible. He couldn't listen to the stream because he couldn't stop listening to himself. He watched the water flowing past his rock. He saw a dead leaf, bright yellow, get caught in a small eddy, spinning around and around in circles before finally breaking free and floating downstream. He felt a pang of recognition. That was him. Trapped in an eddy of his own thoughts, spinning in the same circles of regret and blame, unable to join the flow of life. He took a deep breath. He would try again. This time, he would not try to silence his mind. That was a battle he could not win. He would simply try to focus on the sound itself, as if it were the only thing in the entire world. He closed his eyes again. He let the thoughts come, but he tried to keep a small part of his attention on the water. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The sound was not one sound, but a symphony of 1,000 tiny sounds. There was the high-pitched trickle, where the water slid over a sheet of smooth green algae. There was the deeper, hollow gurgle as it flowed under the roots of a cedar tree. There was the sharp, percussive splash as a drop fell from an overhanging fern onto the surface of a pool. He could hear the soft, abrasive hiss of sand and tiny pebbles being rolled along the bottom. He focused on one sound, then another. He followed the journey of a single drop of water in his imagination, from the top of the small cascade to the quiet pool below. His thoughts were still there. The voice of the critic still whispered. But now, it was as if he was sitting on the bank of his own mind. The thoughts were like the leaves and twigs floating in the current. They were there, they were moving, but they were not him. He was the witness, the one who was listening. For a single, fleeting moment, the space between his thoughts widened. In that space, there was only the sound of the water. There was no Kaito, the failed potter. There was no dragon's breath vase. There was no shame, no guilt, no fear. There was only the sound. It was a moment of profound, unburdened stillness. It lasted no longer than a single heartbeat, and then his mind rushed back in, eager to analyze the experience. What was that? Did I do it? Is this the answer? But the moment had happened. A tiny seed of peace had been planted. He had, for the first time, experienced a separation between himself and his suffering. He now understood, in a way that went deeper than words, what the master meant. The stream was not telling him a secret. The stream was simply being a stream. And in listening to it, he was, for a moment, simply being Kaito, a man sitting on a rock. Not a good potter or a bad potter, just a man, breathing, listening, here, now. He stayed by the water as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, content for the first time in a long time to simply be quiet and to listen. As dusk settled, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, Kaito did not move. The air grew cooler, and a gentle mist began to rise from the water, blurring the edges of the stones and trees. The symphony of the stream changed its tune. The sharper, daytime sounds softened into a deeper, more resonant murmur, a lullaby for the coming night. His body, which had been a knot of tension for months, began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, unwind. The tightness in his shoulders eased. The anxious clenching in his stomach loosened its grip. He was not trying to relax. It was happening on its own, a natural consequence of his sustained, gentle attention. He began to notice the world beyond the stream. He felt the cool, damp air on his skin. He heard the chirping of a cricket starting its nightly song. He smelled the rich scent of the damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell of life returning to its source. For months, his senses had been dulled, turned inward, serving only to feed his internal narrative of failure. Now, they were opening up again, like flowers unfurling in the twilight. The world was returning to him, or rather, he was returning to the world. He thought about the nature of the stream itself. It flowed without effort, without ambition. It did not try to be a mighty river or a placid lake. It was simply itself, following the path of least resistance, shaping the land not with force, but with persistence. It met obstacles, a large boulder, a fallen log, not with anger or frustration, but by simply flowing around them, over them, under them. It held nothing back. It did not cling to the water that had passed a moment before, nor did it anxiously await the water that was yet to come. It existed only in this present, flowing moment. This simple observation struck him with the force of a revelation. His own mind was the opposite. It was a dam he had built himself, trying to hold back the river of his own life. He was clinging desperately to the past, to the moment the vase broke, refusing to let it go. He was constantly anxious about the future, a future he saw as permanently stained by that one mistake. He had forgotten how to simply flow. The water that passed him now had come from the high peaks, perhaps as rain or melted snow. It would continue its journey down the mountain, joining other streams, becoming a river, and eventually reaching the vast, unknowable ocean. And from the ocean, it would rise again as clouds and return to the mountains as rain. It was a cycle, endless and unbroken. The water in the stream was never the same, yet the stream was always the stream. He saw his own life in this. The mistake, the shattering of the vase, was like a turbulent rapid in the flow of his own river. It had been violent and disorienting. He had been thrown against the rocks, but he had become so fixated on the turbulence that he had forgotten that the river itself was still flowing. He had tried to build a dam at the site of the rapids, insisting that this one moment of chaos defined the entire river. But the river of life does not stop. It continues to flow, whether you are fighting it or not. As complete darkness fell, the master emerged from his hut, holding a small paper lantern that cast a warm, gentle glow. He walked to the water's edge, his movements silent and sure. He did not seem surprised to see Kaito still sitting on the rock. "The moon is rising," Jiro said, his voice calm and quiet. "And the stream has been speaking all day. Have you heard anything?" Kaito looked at the old man. His face, illuminated by the soft lantern light, was a map of deep lines, but his eyes were clear and bright. The urge to complain, to say that it was all nonsense, was gone. "I heard," Kaito began slowly, choosing his words with care, "that the water makes many sounds. And I heard that my own mind makes many sounds too." He paused. "And I think I heard that the water does not hold on to the rocks it passes. It just keeps flowing." A faint smile touched the corners of the master's lips. It was a smile of acknowledgement, not of praise. "Good," he said. "That is a fine day's listening. Now, you are cold and you must be hungry. Come inside." Kaito followed the master into the small hut. It was a single room, spare and clean. A small fire pit glowed in the center, and the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. There was a sleeping mat in one corner, a low table, and a few simple bowls on a shelf. It was a space of profound simplicity, containing nothing that was not essential. In that moment, Kaito looked back on his own home, filled with the beautiful objects he had created, and saw for the first time that it was also filled with his pride, his attachments, his ambition. This simple hut felt more peaceful than any room he had ever been in. The master had shown him, without a single word of instruction, that peace was not found in accumulating beautiful things, but in letting go of the need for them. The lesson of the stream was continuing, flowing right into the master's simple home. Part 3. The Garden of Impermanence. The next morning, Kaito awoke to a world washed clean. A gentle rain had fallen during the night, and the air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of wet earth and pine. Had slept on a simple mat near the fire pit, a deeper and more restful sleep than he had known in months. The relentless, churning thoughts had quieted, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic sound of the rain on the thatched roof, a sound that seemed to sync with his own breathing, lulling him into a state of profound calm. For the first time, he did not wake with the familiar, cold knot of dread in his stomach. Instead, there was a sense of quiet curiosity, a feeling of being present in a new day, unburdened by the one that had passed. Master Jiro was already awake, sitting in silent meditation near the open doorway. His posture was erect but relaxed, a perfect embodiment of stillness and alertness. Kaito watched him for a moment, hesitant to disturb the deep peace that filled the small hut. The master seemed to be a part of the morning itself, as natural and unmoving as the great boulder outside his door. After a long while, Jiro opened his eyes, not with a start, but with a slow, gentle awareness, as if returning from a far journey. He looked at Kaito and gave a slight nod. "The earth has had a good drink," the master said, his voice as calm as the morning air. "And so must we." He prepared a simple breakfast of hot tea and a small bowl of steamed rice. They ate in silence, a comfortable and companionable silence that needed no words. Kaito found himself paying attention to the simple act of eating in a way he never had before. He noticed the warmth of the bowl in his hands, the subtle, earthy flavor of the tea, the texture of each grain of rice. The meal was not a means to an end, but an experience in itself, a small, quiet ritual that grounded him in the present moment. The lessons of the stream were continuing, flowing into every aspect of this simple life. After they had cleaned their bowls in the stream, the master stood and looked toward a small, walled-off area behind the hut. "The rain has been good for the garden," he said. "Come, there is work to be done, and something to see." Kaito followed him through a small wooden gate into a garden unlike any he had ever seen. It was not a manicured landscape of raked sand and carefully placed rocks, like the gardens of the wealthy lords. Nor was it a practical plot of vegetables, neatly arranged in rows. This garden was a small, wild, and beautiful testament to the flow of life itself. Moss grew thick and green over weathered stones. Ferns unfurled their delicate fronds in the damp shade of a gnarled plum tree. And everywhere there were flowers, not planted in orderly beds, but growing where they had chosen to sprout, a chaotic and harmonious tapestry of color and form. But what struck Kaito most was the state of the garden. It was not perfect. Alongside the vibrant, blooming flowers were plants that had already begun to fade. Petals, softened and browned by the rain, lay scattered on the dark earth. Stalks that had once stood tall were now bent and withered. Seed pods, dry and brittle, had split open, their work of creation finished. The garden was a place that held life and death in the same gentle embrace. It did not hide its decay, it displayed it with the same quiet dignity as its blossoms. "The weeds have grown bold with the rain," the master said, handing Kaito a small, simple trowel. "We must give the other plants room to breathe." For the next few hours, they worked side by side in the damp earth. The work was slow and mindful. Master Jiro did not attack the weeds with aggression, but removed them gently, his movements economical and precise. He taught Kaito to distinguish the unwanted seedlings from the new sprouts of flowers yet to bloom. The physical act of kneeling on the ground, of feeling the cool, crumbly soil in his hands, was deeply therapeutic. It was the work of a potter, in a way, but in reverse. Instead of shaping the earth into a fixed form, he was helping to clear the way for the earth to express itself in its own fluid, ever-changing forms. As he worked, his mind, which had been so quiet, began to stir again. He found himself comparing the weeds to his own negative thoughts. He wanted to rip them out, to eradicate them completely, to have a perfectly clean and untroubled mind, just as he had wanted a perfectly flawless vase. He pulled at a stubborn root with frustration, and it snapped, leaving the main part still buried in the earth, ready to sprout again. The master, noticing his struggle, paused in his work. He pointed to a patch of brilliant blue morning glories, their trumpet-shaped blossoms wide open to the morning sky. "Look at these," he said. "They are beautiful, are they not? They bloomed only this morning. They have waited all season for this one day of glory." Kaito nodded, admiring their delicate, vibrant beauty. They were perfect. Then, the master pointed to a nearby stalk where the flowers had already withered. The blue trumpets had collapsed into limp, purple-grey knots. They were shriveled and dying. "And these?" Jiro asked. "Are they not also beautiful in their own way? Their work is done. They have lived their life, and now they are returning to the earth to nourish the seeds of next year's flowers. Is their fading any less a part of the garden's beauty than the blooming?" Kaito looked from the vibrant blossoms to the withered ones. His first instinct was to see one as good and the other as bad, one as a success and the other as a failure. But the master's question invited him to look deeper. He saw that they were not two separate things, but two parts of the same process. The bloom could not exist without the seed, and the seed could not exist without the withered flower. It was a single, continuous cycle of becoming and passing away. There was no permanent state of perfection. The beauty of the morning glory was precisely in its fleetingness. It was beautiful because it was not meant to last forever. "We call this anicca," Master said softly, as if sensing Kaito's thoughts. "Impermanence. Nothing is permanent. Not the flower, not the weed, not the mountain, not our own bodies, not our thoughts, not our feelings. Everything arises, stays for a time, and then passes away. Joy arises and passes away. Sadness arises and passes away. Even our greatest triumphs and our most painful failures, they too arise, and they too will pass away." The master's words fell like gentle rain on the dry soil of Kaito's mind. He looked down at his hands, covered in dirt. He thought of the dragon's breath vase. He had wanted it to be a permanent testament to his skill, an object that would last for centuries, carrying his name into the future. He had tried to create something that would stand outside the flow of time. He had become attached to an idea of permanence, and when the vase shattered, his world had shattered with it, because he had staked his entire sense of self on something that was, by its very nature, impermanent. The crack in the vase was not a sign of his failure as a potter. It was a sign that the vase was a part of the world, subject to the same laws as everything else. It was subject to heat and cold, to stress, to the subtle imperfections of the clay itself. He had seen the crack as an enemy, an intruder in his perfect creation. But now, sitting in this garden of life and decay, he began to see it differently. The crack was simply the vase's story. It was the moment the vase revealed its own impermanence, its own truth. "You have been holding on to one moment in the stream," Jiro continued, his gaze soft and compassionate. "You have built a house on a single, passing wave, and you are surprised that it has collapsed. You are trying to preserve a single, perfect blossom from this garden, keeping it in a dark room, away from the wind and the rain. But in trying to preserve it, you are killing it. The only way to truly appreciate the flower is to see it as it is, blooming in this moment, and to know that in the next moment, it will be different. You must let your failure be a withered flower. Acknowledge its part in the garden of your life, see that it has passed, and let it return to the earth." Kaito looked around the garden with new eyes. He saw the truth of the master's words everywhere. He saw the life cycle in the ferns, from the tightly coiled fiddleheads just emerging from the soil, to the broad green fronds, to the yellowing decaying ones that lay flat against the ground. He saw it in the gnarled plum tree, its bare branches a testament to winters past, its new buds a promise of springs to come. The garden was not a static picture of perfection. It was a living, breathing story of change. His mistake was not a permanent stain on his character. It was a moment. A painful moment, a significant moment, but a moment nonetheless. It had arisen. It had stayed for a time, a very long and painful time, and now, perhaps, it was ready to pass away. He had been clinging to it, replaying it, feeding it with his attention, refusing to let it become a part of the past. He had been trying to stop the seasons from changing in the garden of his own mind. He reached out and gently touched a withered morning glory. The petals were damp and delicate, almost translucent. He felt a sense of tenderness for it, a quiet respect for its completed journey. It was not ugly, it was simply finished. And in its finishing, it was making way for something new. He thought of the shards of his vase. He had swept them up and hidden them away in a wooden box, as if they were evidence of a crime. He had been ashamed of them, but perhaps they were not just remnants of a failure. Perhaps they were like the withered flower, like the fallen leaves, a necessary part of a cycle he had not yet understood. They worked on in silence for the rest of the morning, but the silence was now filled with a new understanding. Kaito's movements became more like the master's, gentle, attentive, and unhurried. He was no longer just pulling weeds. He was tending the garden of impermanence, both outside himself and within. Each weed he removed was a practice in letting go. He would see a thought of failure arise in his mind, and he would acknowledge it, just as he acknowledged a weed. He would see it clearly, without judgment, and then gently, he would return his attention to the feeling of the earth in his hands, to the sound of the birds in the trees, to the simple, rhythmic act of his own breathing. He was not fighting his thoughts anymore. He was simply choosing not to water them. When the sun was high in the sky, they stopped. The garden looked clearer, more spacious. The flowers seemed to lift their heads to the light, freed from the encroaching weeds. Kaito stood up, stretching his aching back. He felt a clean kind of tired, the satisfying exhaustion that comes from meaningful work. He looked at his hands, the dirt caked under his fingernails. These were the same hands that had trembled with anxiety, the same hands he believed had lost their skill. But here, in this garden, they had been capable and steady. They had served a purpose. They had helped to bring a little more harmony to this small patch of earth. As they walked back toward the hut, Kaito paused and looked back at the garden. It was a place of profound and simple truth. It taught a lesson that no book or sutra could convey as powerfully. Life is change. To resist change is to suffer. To accept change, to flow with it, to see the beauty and the bloom and the wither, the success and the failure, that is the path to peace. He had come to the mountain seeking a cure for his brokenness, an answer to his suffering. He had not been given an answer. He had been shown a garden, and in it, he was beginning to find a way to heal himself. The heavy chains of his past felt a little lighter, their metallic clanking replaced by the soft, rustling sound of leaves returning to the earth. Over the next few days, the garden became Kaito's temple and his teacher. Each morning, he would join the master in the quiet work of tending to the plants. He learned to read the subtle language of the leaves, to know when a plant was thirsty or when it was receiving too much sun. He learned the names of the different flowers and herbs, not from a book, but from the master's quiet pointing and simple explanations. He discovered a world of intricate detail he had never noticed before. The delicate veins on a petal, the way a tendril of a climbing vine would curl around a bamboo stake, the army of ants marching purposefully along a stone border. His focus, once narrowed to the single point of his failure, was now expanding to encompass this vast and complex web of life. One afternoon, a sudden, fierce wind swept down from the mountain peaks. It tore through the clearing, whipping the trees into a frenzy and flattening the more delicate flowers. Kaito's immediate instinct was one of alarm. He wanted to rush out and protect the plants, to shield the beautiful blossoms they had so carefully tended. He looked at Master Jiro, expecting to see a similar concern on his face. But the old man was sitting calmly by the doorway of his hut, watching the wind as if it were a passing show. He was not distressed. He was simply observing. "The wind is a strong gardener," Jiro said, his voice carrying easily over the roar. "It breaks the weak branches to make the tree stronger. It scatters the seeds far and wide, to places they could not reach on their own. Do not be so quick to judge it as a destroyer." Kaito watched as a shower of pink petals from a camellia bush was ripped away by a gust and sent swirling into the air like confetti. It was a beautiful, violent dance. A moment ago, those petals had been part of a perfect flower. Now they were scattered, their form dissolved, their purpose seemingly ended. He felt a familiar pang of loss, the echo of his own shattered vase. But then he remembered the lesson of the withered morning glory. This was just another form of change, another expression of anicca. The wind was not an enemy of the garden, it was a part of it. It was the force that ensured the garden would not remain static, that it would always be in a state of renewal. When the wind finally passed, leaving a stillness that felt even deeper than before, they went out to survey the garden. Some plants were damaged, their stems broken. The ground was littered with leaves and petals. But the garden was not destroyed. It was merely changed. Kaito saw that the stronger, more flexible plants, like the bamboo, had simply bent with the wind and were now standing tall again. The more rigid plants had been the ones to suffer. "There is a lesson here," the master said, as he gently pruned a broken branch from a small maple tree. "The heart that is rigid and clings to how things should be will be broken by the winds of life. The heart that is flexible, that can bend with the unexpected, will endure. You have been trying to be a porcelain vase in a world of wind. Perhaps it is time to learn to be like the bamboo." The master's words resonated deeply. Kaito's suffering had come from his rigid attachment to a single outcome, the perfect, unbroken vase. When the world presented him with a different reality, he had not bent. He had shattered internally. His refusal to accept what had happened, his insistence on clinging to the ghost of what might have been, was the source of his pain. The event itself was the wind. His suffering was his own rigidity. He began to see this principle everywhere. He saw it in the way the stream adapted its course around a new fallen rock. He saw it in the way the moss grew to fit the exact contours of the stone it covered. The entire mountain was a living scripture of yielding, of adaptation, of impermanence. The world was not demanding perfection from him. It was inviting him to participate in its constant, imperfect, beautiful dance of change. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Kaito felt a shift within himself. It was not a sudden, dramatic enlightenment, but a quiet, gentle loosening of a knot he had been holding for a long time. The story of his failure, the one he had carried up the mountain like a heavy sack of stones, no longer seemed to be the only story. It was just one story among many. It was the story of a withered flower, of a wind-tossed petal, of a broken branch. It was a story of impermanence. And because it was impermanent, it did not have to be the end of the story. He felt the first, tentative stirring of a new possibility, a feeling that was not quite hope, but was its quiet, humble cousin, acceptance. He was beginning to accept the garden of his life as it was, with its blooms and its weeds, its sunshine and its storms. And in that acceptance, he found the seed of a peace he had thought was lost to him forever. Part 4. The Cracked Teacup. A week passed, marked not by the counting of days, but by the rhythm of the sun and the moon, the work in the garden, and the endless song of the stream. Kaito's mind was becoming like the clearing in the forest, quieter, more spacious. The voice of his inner critic had not vanished entirely, but its once deafening shouts had subsided into occasional whispers, and he was learning not to mistake those whispers for the truth. He was learning to be the sky, not the passing clouds. The physical labor, the simple food, and the deep, dreamless sleep were mending him in ways he did not yet fully understand. He felt his body growing stronger, his senses sharper, his spirit lighter. One afternoon, after a long morning of clearing a new patch of ground for planting, Master Jiro invited him for tea. This was not unusual. They often shared a simple cup of tea in the afternoon. But today, there was a subtle, ceremonial quality to it, the master's movements that caught Kaito's attention. Jiro did not use the plain, everyday bowls they usually drank from. Instead, he brought out a small, lacquered wooden box. He opened it with a reverence that made Kaito lean forward in anticipation. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a teacup. It was a beautiful object, made of fine, cream-colored porcelain with a delicate, almost translucent quality. Its shape was simple but elegant, a testament to the skill of the hand that had formed it. But what made Kaito hold his breath was the network of fine, golden lines that crisscrossed its surface. The cup had clearly been broken, shattered into several pieces, and then painstakingly put back together. But instead of trying to hide the cracks, the artist had highlighted them, filling them with what looked like pure gold, creating a shimmering, intricate pattern that made the cup more beautiful, more striking than it could ever have been in its original, unbroken state. The lines of gold were not scars of damage, they were veins of light, a map of the cup's own unique history. The master handled the cup with gentle care. He warmed it with hot water, then emptied it before carefully spooning in powdered green tea. He whisked the tea with a small bamboo whisk, his movements fluid and precise, until a vibrant, jade-colored foam formed on the surface. He then turned the cup so that its most beautiful golden seam faced Kaito, and presented it to him with both hands. Kaito received the cup as if it were a sacred artifact. He held it in his palms, the porcelain warm against his skin. He traced one of the golden lines with his thumb, feeling the slightly raised texture of the repair. It was exquisite. The original cup had been a thing of quiet, understated beauty. This mended cup was a thing of profound, resilient beauty. It did not hide its history of being broken, it celebrated it. He took a sip of the tea. The flavor was rich and slightly bitter, a perfect counterpoint to the sweetness of the small rice cake the master had placed beside it. But his attention was wholly on the cup. As a potter, he had always strived for perfection. A cracked piece was a failure, something to be discarded, hidden, forgotten. His entire workshop was a graveyard of his perceived imperfections, a pile of shards behind the kiln that represented every time he had fallen short of his own impossible standards. The dragon's breath vase was just the largest, most painful piece on that pile. To see a broken object treated not as a failure, but as something worthy of being mended with gold, was a complete reversal of everything he had ever believed. They sat in silence for a long time, Kaito simply holding and observing the cup, the master simply watching him. Finally, Jiro spoke, his voice as gentle as the steam rising from the tea. "This is called kintsugi," he said, "the art of golden joinery. We believe that when something has been broken and has a history, it becomes more beautiful. The breaks are a part of the object's life, not an end to it. To hide the repair is to pretend that the breakage never happened, but to highlight it with gold is to accept its history and to find the beauty in its imperfection." Kaito looked from the golden lines on the cup to the invisible cracks in his own heart. He had been trying to hide his brokenness, to cover it with shame and silence. He had been acting as if his life were over because he was no longer perfect, no longer the master potter with an unblemished record. He had seen his failure as a source of immense shame. But what if it wasn't? What if this devastating crack in his life was not something to be hidden, but something to be mended with gold? "The world is not interested in your perfection," the master continued, as if reading his thoughts. "Perfection is a rigid, lifeless state. A perfectly smooth stone has no crevices for the moss to grow. A perfectly straight path has no interesting views. It is our cracks, our imperfections, our vulnerabilities that allow the light to get in. It is how we mend ourselves after being broken that gives us our true beauty and strength." He picked up a plain, unbroken cup from the shelf. "This one is useful," he said, setting it down next to the kintsugi cup. "It holds tea. It serves its purpose. But it has no story. It has not been tested. It does not know its own strength. This one," he said, gently touching the mended cup. "This one knows what it is to be in pieces. It knows the care of the hands that put it back together. It has been transformed by its experience. It is not just useful, it is wise. It is not just beautiful, it is resilient." Kaito felt a profound shift inside him, a cracking of the hard shell of shame he had built around himself. The master was not just talking about a teacup, he was talking about him. He was the broken vessel, and for months he had been staring at the shards, believing they were worthless. He had never considered the possibility of mending. He had only seen the end, not the potential for a new beginning. "But, Master," Kaito said, his voice thick with emotion, "the mending, it requires such skill and gold. I have no gold, and my hands, they tremble. How can I mend myself when I am the one who is broken?" "The gold," Jiro said, his eyes twinkling with a gentle light, "is not a precious metal you must buy in the market. The gold is compassion. It is the loving kindness you apply to your own wounds. The gold is acceptance, the willingness to see your cracks not as flaws, but as part of your unique and beautiful story. The gold is the wisdom you gain from having been broken. You already have all the gold you need." He paused, letting the words settle. "As for your hands," he continued, "they do not need to be perfectly steady. The hands that mend with kintsugi are patient. They are gentle. They honor each piece, no matter how small. They do not force the pieces together, but find how they fit naturally. Your healing is not a matter of forcing yourself to be whole again. It is a slow, patient, and loving process of gathering up your broken pieces and seeing how they can be joined with the gold of self-compassion. Self-compassion. The concept was alien to Kaito. He had always been his own harshest critic, driving himself relentlessly toward an unattainable ideal. He had believed that this harshness was the source of his skill, the fire that forged his mastery. He had never considered that kindness toward himself could be a source of strength. He had treated his own heart and mind with a severity he would never have shown to a lump of unformed clay. He looked at the cup again. The golden lines were not perfectly smooth or uniform. They followed the chaotic, jagged edges of the original breaks. The artist had not tried to impose a new, perfect pattern on the cup. They had simply followed the truth of its brokenness. The beauty came from honoring the reality of the damage, not from trying to erase it. This was the path forward. He did not need to pretend the dragon's breath vase never broke. He did not need to erase the memory or the pain. He needed to accept it. He needed to see that this break was now a part of his story, a part of who he was. And he needed to learn how to apply the gold of compassion to that wound, to transform it from a source of shame into a source of strength and beauty. Every time you use this cup, the master said, you are reminded that brokenness is not the end. It is an opportunity for transformation. The cup is more precious now, not despite being broken, but because it was broken. Your life can also be more precious, more compassionate, more wise, precisely because you have known this deep suffering. Do not waste this precious breaking. Kaito finished his tea, his movements slow and deliberate. He held the empty cup in his hands for a long time, feeling its weight, its history, its profound lesson. When he finally placed it back on the table, it was with the same reverence the master had shown. He was no longer just a failed potter. He was a broken vessel, holding the promise of being mended with gold. The idea did not erase his pain, but it gave it a new meaning, a new purpose. It was no longer a dead end. It was a crooked, golden path leading toward a new kind of wholeness. That evening, as the moon cast its silver light over the clearing, Kaito did not dwell on the memory of the shattering vase. Instead, he held the image of the kintsugi teacup in his mind. He pictured the jagged edges of his own pain, and then, in his imagination, he began to trace those edges with a soft, warm, golden light. It was the light of acceptance, the light of compassion, the light of the possibility that his deepest wound could become his greatest beauty. He did not know how to do this in practice, but for the first time believed it was possible. The chains of his past were not gone, but he could now see that they were not made of cold, heavy iron. They were made of something that could be melted down and transformed, something that could be spun into threads of pure, shining gold. The lesson of the kintsugi cup stayed with Kaito, settling deep within him like a seed planted in fertile ground. It was not an intellectual understanding. It was a felt sense, a shift in the very landscape of his being. He began to look at the world through the lens of this newfound wisdom. He saw kintsugi everywhere. He saw it in the ancient cedar tree by the stream, one of its massive branches long ago struck by lightning. The tree had not died. It had healed around the wound, the new bark forming a gnarled, powerful scar that spoke of its resilience. The scar did not diminish the tree's majesty. It enhanced it, telling a story of survival and strength. He saw it in the master's own face. The deep lines etched around Jiro's eyes and mouth were not signs of decay, but maps of a life lived fully, filled with laughter and sorrow, concentration and ease. They were the golden seams of a long and compassionate existence. He even saw it in the patched robe the master wore. The patches, sewn with careful, visible stitches of a different colored thread, did not make the robe look poor or shabby. They made it look loved, cared for, its history honored rather than discarded. The world, he was beginning to realize, did not celebrate flawlessness. It celebrated endurance. It celebrated the beauty of the mend. He started to re-examine the story of his own life. He had always seen it as a straight line of progress, a steady climb toward the peak of mastery. The breaking of the vase was a catastrophic fall from that path, a plunge into an abyss. But now, he wondered if the path was not meant to be a straight line at all. Perhaps it was meant to be a meandering journey, full of cracks and detours. He thought of his own apprenticeship, the countless bowls he had misshapen, the glazes that had run, the pots that had cracked in the kiln. At the time, he had seen them as frustrating failures, obstacles on the way to his goal. Now, he saw that they had not been obstacles, they had been the path itself. Each mistake had taught him something essential. Each crack had been a lesson in the nature of clay, the limits of heat, the necessity of patience. His skill was not built on a foundation of successes, but on a mountain of mended failures. He had been practicing kintsugi all his life, without even knowing it. This realization brought with it a wave of tenderness for his younger self, the earnest, striving boy who had been so afraid of making mistakes. He had been so hard on that boy, demanding a perfection that was impossible. He saw now that this harsh inner critic was not a wise teacher, but a fearful tyrant, driven by a deep-seated belief that he was not worthy unless he was flawless. The gold of compassion began to flow backward in time, mending the old wounds of his apprenticeship, the small, forgotten hurts of 1,000 tiny failures. One day, the master asked Kaito to repair a small crack in the stone path that led from the hut to the stream. A winter frost had heaved the earth, and one of the flat stones had split in two. Jiro did not ask him to replace the stone, but to mend it. Kaito studied the break. It was a clean, sharp crack. His first instinct, the old potter's instinct, was to mix some mortar and fill the crack, trying to make the repair as invisible as possible, to restore the illusion of wholeness. He was about to begin when he stopped. He looked at his hands, then at the broken stone. He thought of the teacup. Hiding the crack was pretending it never happened. It was an act of shame. What would it mean to honor this break? He went to the stream and searched along its banks until he found what he was looking for. A handful of small white pebbles, worn smooth and luminous by the water. He returned to the path and carefully, patiently, he set the white pebbles into the crack, one by one, securing them with a mixture of clay and sand. It was slow, meticulous work. He was not just filling a gap, he was creating a new pattern. When he was finished, a bright, winding line of white snaked across the dark grey stone. It looked like a miniature river or a vein of pure quartz. The path was no longer just a path, it was a story. It told of the power of the winter frost and the care of the hands that had mended the damage. The repair had added a new layer of beauty and meaning to the simple stone. The master came and looked at his work. He said nothing, but a deep, approving smile lit up his face. In that moment, Kaito understood. This was the practice. This was how he would learn to mend himself. Not by trying to force the broken pieces of his psyche back into their old shape, but by gently, patiently, filling the cracks with something new, something beautiful, something that honored the break. He began to apply this practice to his own mind. When a painful memory of his failure would arise, he would no longer try to push it away or drown it in self-criticism. Instead, he would treat it like the broken stone. He would acknowledge the crack. He would feel the sharp edges of the pain, and then he would gently, mentally, lay a single white pebble into the fissure. The pebble might be a moment of gratitude for the lessons he was learning, It might be the memory of the master's compassionate eyes. It might be the feeling of the cool, damp earth in his hands as he worked in the garden. He would not try to erase the memory, but to embed it in a new context of healing and growth. It was not easy. Some days, the old habits of mind were strong. The inner critic would rise up, its voice full of scorn, telling him this was all foolishness, that he was just hiding from the truth of his inadequacy. On those days, the cracks felt like gaping chasms, and he felt he had no pebbles large enough to fill them. But he would remember the master's words, "The hands that mend are patient." He would not fight the critic. He would simply acknowledge its presence like a storm cloud passing in the sky, and then gently return his attention to laying one small, white pebble. He would focus on his breath, on the sound of the stream, on the feeling of the solid earth beneath him. He was learning to mend himself not with force, but with a quiet, persistent gentleness. The gold was compassion, and the practice was patience. And slowly, painstakingly, a new and beautiful pattern began to form in the broken landscape of his heart. Part 5. A bowl of plain rice. The days continued to flow one into the next, each one a lesson in simplicity and presence. Kaito's life, which had once been a complex and striving affair, driven by ambition and the pursuit of recognition, had been distilled to its most essential elements: waking, working, eating, sleeping. And in this radical simplicity, he was discovering a richness he had never known. The world, which had seemed grey and threatening through the lens of his despair, was now revealing its vibrant, intricate beauty in the smallest of details. One of the most profound teachings came not in the garden or through a philosophical discussion, but in the simple, daily act of eating. The meals at the master's hut were unchanging. Twice a day they would share a meal of steamed brown rice, a small portion of pickled vegetables, and a thin broth made from miso and whatever wild greens the master had gathered. There was no meat, no fish, no sugar, no elaborate sauces. It was the humblest of fare, the kind of food a poor farmer might eat. In his village, Kaito had been a man of some standing. His meals, while not lavish, were varied and flavorful. He had taken for granted the abundance of the market, the skill of his wife's cooking, the pleasure of a full stomach. At first, he found the simple diet challenging. His palate, accustomed to stronger flavors, felt unsatisfied. His mind, accustomed to distraction, grew restless during the long, silent meals. He would find himself thinking of other foods, of past feasts, of the satisfaction of a well-seasoned dish. He was eating, but he was not truly there. His body was at the low wooden table in the mountain hut, but his mind was wandering in the marketplaces of memory and desire. Master Jiro, as always, seemed to notice everything without saying a word. He ate with a slow, deliberate grace that was in itself a form of meditation. He would lift his small, dark brown bowl with both hands, as if it were a precious gift. He would look at the rice for a moment before taking the first bite, a look of quiet gratitude. He chewed each mouthful slowly, his attention fully absorbed in the act. For the master, eating was not a mere refueling of the body. It was a ceremony of connection with the earth, the sun, the rain, and the labor of the farmers who had grown the food. One day, as Kaito was rushing through his meal, his mind already on the afternoon's task of chopping wood, the master finally spoke. He did not chide or instruct. He simply asked a question. "Kaito," he said, his voice calm and gentle, "tell me, what are you eating?" The question was so simple it caught Kaito off guard. "Rice, master," he replied, a little confused. "And pickles." "And what is rice?" Jiro asked, his gaze steady. Kaito hesitated. "It is a grain, a food." "Look closer," the master encouraged. In this single bowl of rice, can you not see the entire universe? Can you not see the rich, dark earth that nourished the seed? Can you not feel the warmth of the sun that made it grow? Can you not taste the rain that quenched its thirst? Can you not see the farmer, his back bent under the hot sun, planting the seedlings, tending the paddies, harvesting the grain? Can you not see the clouds in the sky, the mountains that cradle the fields, the long journey the rice has taken to arrive in your bowl? Jiro held up his own bowl. To eat this rice with a distracted mind is to be blind to the miracle of it. It is to dishonor the earth, the sun, the rain, and the farmer. When we eat, we are taking the life of the world into our own bodies. It is a sacred act. This is not just a bowl of plain rice. This is a bowl of life itself. It is a bowl of interconnectedness. Kaito looked down at his own bowl. The simple, brown grains of rice suddenly looked different. They were no longer a bland, monotonous substance. He saw them as the master did, as the culmination of a vast and intricate process, a gift from the world. He had been eating with his mouth, but not with his heart, not with his mind. He had been consuming without receiving. The way you eat, the master continued, is the way you live your life. If you rush through your meal, your mind elsewhere, you are also rushing through your days, your mind always in the past or the future, never here. If you eat with resentment for the food's simplicity, you are living with resentment for your life's simplicity. But if you can learn to eat this simple bowl of rice with full attention, with gratitude, with a quiet joy for the nourishment it provides, then you will learn to live your life in the same way. From that day on, Kaito approached his meals differently. He followed the master's example. He would take a moment before eating to simply look at his food, to contemplate its origins, to feel a sense of gratitude for its presence. He ate slowly, putting down his chopsticks between bites. He paid attention to the texture of the rice, the sharp, salty tang of the pickle, the earthy warmth of the miso broth. He tried to keep his mind from wandering, and when it did, he would gently guide it back to the sensations of eating. It was a powerful practice. He discovered that the simple food, when eaten with full attention, was more satisfying than any of the elaborate meals he had once craved. He began to taste not just the food itself, but the care with which it was prepared, the life force within it. The meals became islands of deep stillness in his day, moments to practice the same gentle, non-judgmental awareness he had learned by the stream and in the garden. One evening, after they had finished their meal and were sipping tea by the fire, the master took the lesson a step further. "Your body needs this rice to be healthy and strong," Jiro said, holding his empty bowl. "Without it, you would grow weak and sick. Your heart and mind are the same. They also need nourishment. They need to be fed." "What is the food for the heart, Master?" Kaito asked. "Compassion," the master replied without hesitation. "Kindness. The same way you offer this food to your body, you must offer compassion to your heart, especially to the parts of your heart that are hungry, the parts that are in pain." He looked at Kaito with a deep, knowing kindness. "For many months you have been starving your heart. You have been feeding it a diet of blame, shame, and criticism. You have given it poison and wondered why it is sick. Your inner critic is a cruel cook, serving you the same bitter meal day after day. It is time to change the menu." The master's words were simple, yet they struck Kaito with immense force. He had seen his suffering as a mental problem, a flaw in his thinking. He had not thought of it as a form of self-starvation. He had not considered that his heart was a living thing that required gentle nourishment. Self-compassion, Jiro explained, is not self-pity or self-indulgence. It is not about ignoring your mistakes or pretending they did not happen. It is simply about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a good friend who was suffering. If your friend had made the same mistake, Would you berate him endlessly? Would you tell him he was worthless and that his life was over? Or would you offer him comfort? Would you remind him of his good qualities? Would you encourage him to learn from his mistake and to try again? Kaito thought about it. He would never treat a friend the way he had been treating himself. He would have been gentle, supportive, forgiving. The realization was startling. He had been withholding from himself the most basic form of human kindness. This is the practice, the master said. When the voice of the critic arises, when you feel the familiar pain of your failure, you must learn to offer yourself a bowl of compassionate rice. You must learn to speak to yourself as you would speak to a beloved friend. You can say, "This is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself in this moment? May I give myself the compassion that I need," he encouraged. Kaito to see his pain not as a sign of his inadequacy, but as a sign that his heart was hungry for kindness. The pain was a signal, a call for attention, a request for nourishment. By responding to it with harshness, he was only making the hunger worse. Kaito began to practice this new form of inner nourishment. It felt strange and unnatural at first. The habit of self-criticism was so deeply ingrained. When a wave of shame washed over him, his instinct was to tense up, to brace himself, to agree with the critical voice. To consciously choose to be kind to himself in that moment felt like a radical act of rebellion against a lifetime of conditioning. He started small. When he would stumble on a tree root while walking, instead of the usual flash of self-annoyance, "Clumsy!" he would pause, take a breath, and think, "It's okay. Everyone stumbles." When he felt a moment of sadness looking at the withered flowers in the garden, instead of falling into a larger despair about his own life, he would place a hand on his own heart and say to himself, "This is sadness. It is a part of the human experience. May I be gentle with this feeling." It was like learning a new language, the language of inner kindness. He was clumsy with it, often forgetting the words, but he kept practicing. He realized that the silent meals were a perfect training ground. As he offered his body the simple, wholesome food, he would simultaneously try to offer his heart the same quality of gentle, unconditional nourishment. With each mindful bite of rice, he would silently offer himself a grain of compassion. With each sip of tea, a drop of acceptance. He discovered that self-compassion was not a weak or passive state. It was a source of profound strength and resilience. The more he was able to meet his own pain with kindness, the less power the pain had over him. It was no longer a terrifying monster to be fought or fled from. It was more like a crying child that needed to be held and comforted. By offering it comfort, he was not indulging it, he was healing it. The bowl of plain rice became his most powerful symbol. It represented the simple, essential, life-sustaining nourishment that was always available to him, both physically and emotionally. He did not need elaborate feasts or profound spiritual breakthroughs. He just needed to remember to feed himself, kindly and mindfully, one simple bowl at a time. The healing he was seeking was not in some distant future, after he had atoned for his mistakes or achieved some new level of perfection. The healing was here, now, in this moment, in the simple, compassionate act of lifting a bowl of rice to his lips. This practice of mindful eating and self-compassion began to ripple outward, changing Kaito's relationship not just with himself, but with the world around him. As he learned to nourish his own heart, he found that his heart had more to offer others. He had always been a reserved man, polite and respectful in his dealings, but emotionally distant. His focus had been on his craft, his art, and the perfection of the objects he created. Now, his focus was shifting to the perfection of his attention, the quality of his presence. He remembered the villagers who had tried to comfort him after his failure. His wife, with her gentle, worried eyes. His old friend, the carpenter, who had brought him a flask of sake and sat with him in silence. The woman from the market who had pressed a sweet persimmon into his hand, saying nothing, but conveying everything with her small gesture of kindness. At the time, he had been so walled off by his own shame that he had been unable to truly receive their offerings. He had seen their kindness through the distorted lens of his own self-loathing, interpreting it as pity. Now, he replayed those memories and saw them for what they were: bowls of compassionate rice being offered to him by his community. He felt a surge of warmth and gratitude, a deep regret for his inability to accept their gifts at the time. He saw that in starving himself of compassion, he had also starved himself of connection. This new understanding changed the way he interacted with the master. Before, he had seen Jiro as an infallible sage, a perfect being from whom he needed to extract wisdom. He had placed the master on a pedestal, creating a separation between them. Now, he began to see Jiro not as a symbol, but as a man. A kind, wise, and deeply human man. He noticed the small things, the way the master would sometimes groan softly as he stood up, his old bones protesting, the quiet joy on his face when he spotted a rare wildflower in the garden, the occasional flicker of weariness in his eyes at the end of a long day. Seeing the master's humanity did not diminish his respect for him, it deepened it. It made the master's teachings more accessible, more real. Jiro was not teaching from a place of detached, otherworldly perfection. He was teaching from a life of practice, a life of tending to his own garden, of mending his own broken cups, of mindfully eating his own bowl of rice. One afternoon, a traveling monk stopped at the hut, seeking shelter from an impending storm. He was young, his face etched with the hardships of the road, his robe dusty and worn. Jiro welcomed him without question, offering him tea and the last of their rice. Kaito watched as the master listened to the young monk's stories of his travels, his questions about the Dharma, his anxieties about his own practice. Jiro listened with the same complete, unwavering attention he had given to Kaito. He did not offer easy answers or grand pronouncements. He simply listened, and in his listening, he created a space of profound acceptance and safety. He was offering the young monk a space to be seen and heard without judgment. He was feeding the monk's heart. Kaito realized that this was the essence of true compassion. It was not a grand, heroic act. It was the simple, humble act of being present for another's suffering, of offering them the nourishment of your full attention. It was what the master had done for him when he had first arrived, broken and desperate. Jiro had not offered a cure, he had offered a space to heal. After the young monk had left the next morning, his spirit visibly lighter, Kaito felt a deep desire to cultivate this quality in himself. He had spent so much of his life focused on creating beautiful objects. Perhaps the true art, the highest craft, was in creating a beautiful presence, a presence that could be a source of nourishment for others. He began to practice this in small ways. When the master spoke, he tried to listen with his whole being, not just waiting for his turn to speak or for a piece of wisdom he could grasp. He tried to listen to the spaces between the words, to the feeling behind them. He practiced with the world around him. He would listen to the wind not just as a sound, but as a presence. He would feel the sun on his skin not just as warmth, but as a connection to the vast, fiery star that gave life to his world. The bowl of plain rice became a koan for him, a question he lived with day after day. What does it truly mean to be nourished? What is the food that truly sustains a human life? He saw that his ambition, his desire for fame and recognition, had been a form of junk food. It had given him a temporary, fleeting satisfaction, but it had left his deeper self hungry. It had been a meal for the ego, not for the heart. The true nourishment was in the simple, the present, the real. It was in the taste of the rice, the warmth of the sun, the feeling of the earth, the kindness of a friend, the shared silence with a teacher. This shift was profound. It was a movement away from a life of getting praise, getting respect, getting perfection, to a life of receiving the gift of the present moment, receiving the nourishment of the world, receiving the wisdom of his own pain. And in learning to receive, he found he had so much more to give. His hands, which he had once thought were only for shaping clay, could also be used to tend a garden, to mend a stone path, to offer a cup of tea to a weary traveller. His heart, which he had thought was broken beyond repair, was in fact a bowl. And by filling it with compassion for himself, he was discovering that its capacity to hold compassion for others was boundless. The plainest bowl, when filled, can feed the world. Part 6. The Empty Boat. As the season began to turn, the vibrant greens of summer softening into the first hints of autumn gold, Kaito felt a corresponding shift within himself. The raw, sharp edges of his pain had been soothed, not by forgetting, but by the gentle, persistent application of mindfulness and compassion. He was learning to live with his past, not as a prisoner chained to a memory, but as a traveler carrying a story.
Story was still a part of him, but it no longer defined him. It was one chapter, not the entire book. He had grown comfortable in the quiet rhythm of life on the mountain. The early morning meditations, the mindful work in the garden, the simple, silent meals. These practices had become the scaffolding that supported his healing. Yet, a part of him remained troubled. He had begun to accept his mistake, to see it through the lens of impermanence and kintsugi. He had started to nourish himself with self-compassion, but there was still a lingering residue of anger, a subtle but persistent bitterness that would surface at unexpected moments. It was an anger directed not at the Lord who had commissioned the vase, nor at the laws of physics that had caused the clay to crack. It was a stubborn, deep-seated anger at himself. It was the feeling of a fool who had been tricked, and the fool and the trickster were one and the same. Why had he allowed that flicker of pride to enter his mind in the first place? Why had he been so attached to the outcome? He understood intellectually that these things were the source of his suffering, but the emotional charge, the feeling of self-betrayal, remained. It was a final, tenacious root that he could not seem to pull. One afternoon, as they sat by the stream, Kaito tried to put this feeling into words for the master. "I feel as though I am in a boat," he said, "and I have been in a long and foolish argument with the person who is rowing. I blame him for steering us into the rocks, for his carelessness, for his pride. I shout at him and curse him. But then I look closely, and I see that there is no one else in the boat. I have been shouting at myself the entire time. I understand this now. But still, I cannot seem to stop being angry at this foolish boatman." Master Jiro listened, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly as if listening to the stream's response as well as Kaito's. When Kaito finished, the master did not speak for a long time. He picked up a small, smooth stone and tossed it into a still pool of water. They watched the ripples spread out, disturbing the perfect reflection of the sky, until the surface was calm once more. "Let me tell you a story," Jiro said, his voice low and steady. "It is an old story, one that has been carried down the river of time. A man, a scholar, decided to take a boat out onto a vast lake to meditate. He found a quiet cove, far from the shore, and anchored his small boat. He closed his eyes and began to settle his mind, enjoying the deep peace of the water and the sky. After some time, as he was deep in his meditation, he felt a sudden, jarring bump. Another boat had collided with his. His eyes flew open, and a surge of anger rose in his chest. Who was this careless fool who had disturbed his peace? He was about to shout, to hurl insults at the person in the other boat for their incompetence and lack of consideration. He turned, his face contorted with rage, his mouth open to speak. But when he looked, he saw that the other boat was empty. It had simply come loose from its moorings somewhere up the shore, and had drifted silently across the lake, carried by the current until it bumped into his own. There was no one to blame. There was no one to be angry at. It was just an empty boat. The master paused, letting the image settle in Kaito's mind. At that moment, Jiro continued, the scholar's anger vanished. It had nowhere to go. You cannot be angry at an empty boat. It is a simple, impersonal event. He suddenly understood. His anger had not been caused by the boat bumping into him. His anger was his own creation, a response he had manufactured in his own mind, based on the assumption that there was someone to blame. The bump was just a bump. The anger was the story he told himself about the bump. He took a deep breath, smiled at the empty boat, and returned to his meditation, his mind clearer and calmer than before. Kaito sat with the story, the image of the empty boat floating in the vast stillness of his mind. He saw himself in the scholar, his eyes closed, seeking peace. He felt the jarring bump, the sound of the cracking vase. He felt the immediate, reflexive surge of anger, the search for someone to blame. And he saw, with a clarity that was both startling and liberating, that he had spent all these months shouting at an empty boat. His mistake, the flicker of pride, the attachment to the outcome, these were not a malicious boatman who had intentionally steered him into the rocks. They were just an empty boat. They were impersonal mental events, drifting on the currents of his conditioned mind. Pride arises. Attachment arises. They are part of the human experience, as natural as a boat coming loose from its moorings. They were not him. They were not a reflection of his true, essential nature. They were simply phenomena that had drifted through his awareness, leading to a painful collision. He had been identifying with the boat. He had been saying, I am pride. I am attachment. I am failure. He had personalized the event, making it the central story of his identity. The story of the empty boat offered him a different perspective. The event was just an event. The pride was just a thought. The attachment was just a feeling. They were empty of any inherent personal meaning. The meaning, and therefore the suffering, was what he had added. The world is full of empty boats, the master said softly, his voice blending with the sound of the water. A harsh word from a stranger, a crop that fails, a vase that cracks. These are all empty boats drifting into us. We have no control over them, but we have a choice in how we react. We can rise up in anger, creating waves of suffering in our own hearts, shouting at a phantom boatman. Or we can see that the boat is empty, take a breath, and allow the ripples to subside. Jiro looked directly at Kaito, his gaze penetrating the kind. The boat you have been shouting at, the one you call myself, is also empty. The Kaito who was proud, the Kaito who failed, this is a story you have constructed. It is a collection of thoughts, feelings, and memories, tied together with the string of identity. But it is not the real you. Your true nature is the vast, silent lake upon which all these boats, pride, shame, joy, sorrow, drift for a while and then pass on. You are not the boat, you are the water, you are the sky. This was a profound and radical idea. Kaito had always thought of himself as a solid, continuous entity. Kaito the potter, Kaito the son, Kaito the husband. His failure had felt like a deep crack in this solid self. But the master was suggesting that this solid self was an illusion. It was a story, a mental construction. And if it was just a story, then it could be changed. He could let go of the story of Kaito the failure, just as the scholar had let go of his anger at the empty boat. He thought back to the moment in the kiln, the flicker of pride. This will make my name eternal. That thought had felt so real, so personal. It had felt like his thought. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just a thought that arose in his mind, like a cloud passing through the sky? He hadn't willed it into existence. It had just appeared, a product of his past conditioning, his desire for security, his human longing for meaning. And he had latched onto it, identified with it, and allowed it to steer his ship. Then, when the collision came, he had blamed himself for the thought, instead of seeing that both the thought and the collision were impersonal events, empty boats bumping in the vastness of the lake. "So, what am I to do?" Kaito asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I stop shouting?" "You do not need to stop the shouting," the master replied. "You simply need to see, with clarity, that the boat is empty. The shouting will then stop of its own accord. The anger has no fuel, no target. It dissolves. The practice is not to fight the anger, but to investigate its source. When the anger at yourself arises, ask, 'Who is this self that I am angry at?' Look for it. Can you find a solid, permanent, unchanging self that failed? Or do you only find a collection of fleeting thoughts, feelings, and sensations? When you look for the boatman, you will find only an empty boat." This was the deepest lesson yet. It went beyond mindfulness, beyond compassion. It pointed to the very heart of Zen teaching, the emptiness of self. His suffering was not just caused by his attachment to a vase, it was caused by his attachment to the idea of a self who could succeed or fail. As long as he held on to this idea of a solid self, he would always be vulnerable. Every success would inflate this self, and every failure would threaten to shatter it. Peace was not to be found in building an indestructible self, but in realizing that there was no self to defend in the first place. Kaito sat in silence, the master's words echoing within him. The image of the empty boat became a powerful anchor for his mind. He pictured the scene on the lake over and over. He felt the bump, he felt the surge of anger, and then he saw the empty boat, drifting innocently, a simple object moved by wind and water. And he felt the anger dissolve, replaced by a sense of vast, open space, a sense of freedom. He realized that self-forgiveness was not about one part of him, the good self, forgiving another part, the bad self. That was just two boatmen arguing in the same boat. True self-forgiveness was in realizing that there was no one to forgive. There was only the event, the pain, and the choice to let go of the story about it. It was the ultimate act of letting go of the very idea of the one who had done wrong. The sun began to dip below the mountain ridge, and the clearing was filled with the soft, golden light of late afternoon. The anger that had been a stubborn, bitter root in his heart felt different now. He could still feel its presence, but it was no longer solid. It was becoming translucent, like a ghost in the daylight. He looked at it with curiosity instead of aversion. He investigated it, as the master had suggested. And the more he looked, the less he found. He found only sensations in his body, a tightness in his chest, a heat in his face. He found only thoughts, memories replaying themselves. He could not find a solid, singular self who was angry. There was only the anger, an impersonal energy, a drifting boat. And in seeing its emptiness, he found that he no longer needed to be its passenger. He could simply let it drift on by. This new perspective was like being given a key to a lock he didn't even know existed. For months, he had been trying to fix the boatman, to teach him a lesson, to make him apologize. He had been wrestling with a ghost. The story of the empty boat didn't just offer him a new strategy, it dissolved the conflict itself. Over the next few days, Kaito began to apply this teaching with gentle diligence. It became a new form of meditation. Whenever the familiar pang of self-recrimination arose, he would stop. He would close his eyes, take a breath, and picture the vast, calm lake. He would allow the feeling, the anger, the shame, the regret, to be the other boat. He would watch it drift toward him. He would feel the bump, the jarring contact of the memory. He would observe the reflexive tensing in his body, the immediate surge of emotion. And then, instead of getting caught in the story of who was to blame, he would simply look with his mind's eye and see that the boat was empty. At first, it was difficult. The habit of personalizing his experience was incredibly strong. The voice of the inner critic was a master storyteller, instantly weaving a compelling narrative around them.
Event. See, there you are again, the fool who ruined everything. You are fundamentally flawed. This feeling of shame is the proof of your guilt. The story was seductive, familiar, almost comfortable in its misery. But Kaito persisted. He would listen to the story, and then he would gently ask, "But who is the you in this story? Where is this flawed self?" He would look for it inside himself. He would scan his body, his mind. He found thoughts, but thoughts were not him. They came and went like clouds. He found feelings, but feelings were not him. They arose and subsided like waves on the water. He found memories, but memories were just echoes of the past, not a living, present self. The more he looked for a solid, unchanging boatman to blame, the more he found only the vast, empty space of his own awareness. He began to notice how this pattern of blame played out in smaller, everyday moments. One morning, while chopping wood, the axe slipped and he nicked his finger. The immediate, habitual reaction was a flash of self-directed anger. "Careless! Pay attention!" It was a miniature version of the same process that had tormented him for months, but this time he caught it. He stopped, took a breath, and looked at the situation through the lens of the empty boat. The axe slipped. That was the bump. It was an impersonal event. There was no malicious self who had decided to be careless. There was only a sequence of causes and conditions, a patch of sweat on his hand, a knot in the wood, a momentary lapse of attention. Shouting at himself would not unnick his finger. It would only add a second layer of suffering, the suffering of self-blame, to the simple, physical pain. He saw the boat was empty. He calmly wrapped the small cut with a piece of cloth and returned to his work, his mind clear and undisturbed. This practice began to cultivate a deep sense of lightness and freedom in him. He felt as if he had been carrying a heavy, invisible statue on his back his entire life, the statue of Kaito, and he was finally learning to set it down. He saw that he had been a slave to this statue, constantly polishing it with successes, terrified of it being scratched by failure. Life was so much simpler, so much more spacious without it. He spoke of this with the master one evening. "It feels," Kaito said, "as if I am becoming transparent. The world seems to pass through me more easily. Before, every little thing, every comment, every challenge would hit the hard surface of me and either stick or bounce off. Now, there is less of a surface to hit." Jiro smiled, a warm, knowing smile. "You are discovering your true home," he said. "You are not a stone in the stream, resisting the flow. You are the water itself. The water has no self. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. It is perfectly yielding, yet it can wear away the hardest rock. This is the strength of emptiness. It is not a void, nothingness. It is a boundless potential, a perfect flexibility." Kaito understood. His rigid sense of self, his identity as a master potter, had been his weakness. It was the part of him that was brittle, the part that could be shattered. By letting go of that fixed identity, he was becoming more like water, more like bamboo. He was becoming resilient. The anger he had felt toward himself began to transform into something else entirely. It became a kind of gentle, compassionate humor. He could look back at the man who had been so consumed by pride and ambition, the man who had been so devastated by a single crack in a piece of pottery, and he could smile. He did not smile with scorn, but with a tender understanding, the way a grandfather might smile at the earnest, clumsy antics of his grandchild. He saw the innocence in his own past striving, the universal human longing for worthiness that had driven him.
He was not a villain to be condemned, but a suffering being who had been caught in a web of his own making. In seeing the emptiness of the boatman he had been so angry at, he found not a void, but a deep and abiding compassion for him. He could finally forgive himself, because he finally understood that the self he was forgiving was just a story, a ghost, an empty boat that had simply drifted into a painful shore. Part 7. Weaving a New Robe. The first frost of late autumn laid a delicate silver filigree over the moss and stones in the master's garden. The air grew sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Kaito felt the change of the season not just in the chill on his skin, but as a deep internal signal. A quiet, persistent feeling had been growing within him, a sense that his time on the mountain was drawing to a close. He had not healed in the way he had expected. He had not been given a magic formula to erase his past or restore his former self. Instead, he had been gently guided to disassemble the very idea of that self, to see its constructed nature, and to find a deeper, more resilient identity in the vast, open space of awareness itself. He had arrived as a broken vessel, seeking repair. He would be leaving not as a perfectly mended pot, but as something more like the stream that flowed through the clearing, fluid, adaptable, and unattached to any single form. The mountain had been his sanctuary, a place to safely explore his own inner landscape. But he knew that the true test of his practice would not be here, in this peaceful solitude, but back in the world he had left behind. He could not live in the master's hut forever. He had a wife, a home, a village. He had a life to return to, a life that he now had to learn to live in a new way. He spoke of this with Master Jiro one evening as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the simple wooden walls of the hut. "Master," Kaito began, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension, "I feel that it is soon time for me to return to my village. I do not know what I will find there, or who I will be when I arrive. The man who climbed this mountain is not the same man who will walk back down." Jiro nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "A robe that is worn in a mountain cave may keep you warm," he said, "but its true purpose is to be worn in the wind and the rain of the village. Your practice here has been to weave the threads. Now you must see if the robe will hold together in the world. This is a necessary and beautiful part of the journey." "But I am afraid," Kaito admitted. "I am afraid that the old habits will return, that the noise of the village will drown out the sound of the stream, that I will see my dusty workshop and the old chains will wrap themselves around me again." "The stream is not only on the mountain," the master replied, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "It flows within you now. The garden is not only behind this hut. You carry its seeds of impermanence in your heart. The empty boat is not only on a distant lake, it is the truth of every moment. You are not leaving the teachings behind. You are taking them with you to where they are most needed." Jiro then stood and went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the hut. He opened it and took out a small, folded piece of dark blue cloth. He handed it to Kaito. It was a wrapping cloth, a furoshiki, of the kind used to carry bundles. It was old and faded, but clean and carefully mended in several places with a lighter blue thread. "When you return to your village," the master said, "do not go straight to your workshop. Take a few days. Just walk. Observe. See your village with new eyes, the eyes you have cultivated here. See the people, the work, the flow of life. Do not look for your old place in it. Look for how the stream of your own life can rejoin the larger river." A few days later, the time came. Kaito bowed low to the master, his heart overflowing with a gratitude that words could not express. Jiro simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "The path down the mountain is the same as the path up," he said. Just put one foot in front of the other. Be here for each step. The journey down was profoundly different from the ascent. Before, he had been so lost in the turmoil of his own mind that he had barely noticed the world around him. Now, he was fully present. He noticed the changing colors of the leaves, from fiery maple reds to the deep gold of the ginkgo trees. He felt the crunch of frosty leaves under his feet. He saw the intricate patterns of lichen on the rocks. The world was alive, and he was a part of it, not a troubled observer looking in from the outside. When he reached the outskirts of his village, he followed the master's advice. He did not go to his own home. Instead, he walked toward the part of the village where the artisans lived and worked. He felt like a stranger in his own town, and this sense of being an outsider gave him a fresh perspective. He saw the village not as the stage for his own personal drama of success and failure, but as a complex, living organism. He passed the workshop of his friend, the carpenter, and heard the rhythmic rasp of a wood plane. He saw the focused, meditative expression on his friend's face as he worked, and he recognized the same quality of mindful attention that the master embodied. He passed the dyer's vats, where long bolts of white cotton were being submerged, emerging as a deep, rich indigo. He saw the process of transformation, of something plain becoming beautiful through a patient, careful process. Then, his steps led him to the weaver's hut. He had known the weaver, an old woman named Hannah, his entire life, but he had never truly paid attention to her work. He stood by her open window watching. She sat before a large wooden loom, a complex machine of threads and shuttles that filled most of her small home. Her movements were a blur of practiced efficiency, yet they were not rushed. There was a deep, steady rhythm to her work, like a slow, powerful heartbeat. The shuttle flew back and forth, and with each pass, a new line of color was added to the growing pattern of the cloth on the loom. He watched, mesmerized, for a long time. He saw how the thousands of individual threads, each one fragile on its own, were being interlaced to create a fabric that was strong and beautiful. The vertical threads, the warp, were held taut, providing the structure, the foundation. The horizontal threads, the weft, were carried by the shuttle, creating the pattern, the color, the texture. Both were essential. Without the warp, the weft would be a tangled mess. Without the weft, the warp would be just a collection of empty strings. As he was watching, a thread on the shuttle snapped. The old woman did not sigh in frustration or curse her luck. She simply stopped. She calmly took the two broken ends, and with a few deft, practiced movements, she tied them together in a tiny, almost invisible knot. Then she resumed her work. The shuttle flew, and the knot, the small imperfection, was seamlessly woven into the fabric. It became a part of the pattern. From a few feet away, it was completely unnoticeable. But Hannah knew it was there. It was part of the cloth's story. A profound understanding bloomed in Kaito's heart. This was it. This was the practice he needed to take back into his life. His life was a loom. His past experiences, his skills, his relationships, his joys, these were the warp, the foundation that was already in place. His present moment actions and choices were the weft, the thread he was weaving now. And his mistake, the shattering of the vase, the deep pain of his failure, that was the broken thread. For months, he had believed that because the thread had broken, the entire cloth was ruined. He had wanted to rip the whole thing from the loom and burn it. He had thought the only option was to start over with a new, perfect, unbroken thread. But that was impossible. The past could not be unwoven. Hannah had shown him another way. She had not discarded the broken thread. She had not tried to pretend the break hadn't happened. She had simply tied the ends together and continued weaving. The knot, the memory of the break, was now a part of the fabric. It did not weaken the cloth. In a way, it made it stronger, more authentic. It was a testament to the weaver's ability to incorporate and transform imperfection. He saw that he had to do the same. He had to pick up the broken thread of his life and tie it back together. The knot would be the wisdom he had gained on the mountain, the lessons of the stream, the garden, the kintsugi cup, the empty boat. He had to accept the break, to honor it, and then to integrate it into the ongoing pattern of his life. He could not erase the failure, but he could choose what he wove into the fabric from this moment forward. He could weave in threads of compassion, of mindfulness, of humility. The broken thread, the source of his greatest shame, could become the very point from which a new, more beautiful, and more resilient pattern emerged. This was proactive acceptance. It was not a passive resignation to his fate. It was an active, creative process of taking the raw material of his life, including the broken parts, and weaving it into something of meaning and beauty. He was not just a potter, a shaper of clay. He was a weaver, a shaper of his own life's fabric. He thought of the master's patched robe. Each patch was a story, a place where the robe had been torn and then mended with care. The robe was a map of its own journey, its own vulnerabilities. He wanted to live like that, to wear the fabric of his own life with the same honesty. He did not need to present a flawless, unbroken surface to the world. He could be a man with knots and mended places, and that would be his strength, not his weakness. He stayed by the weaver's window until the light began to fade. He felt a sense of deep peace settle over him, a feeling of clarity and purpose. He finally knew what he had to do. He was not returning to his old life to try and fix it or recreate it. He was returning to pick up the shuttle and begin weaving again, right from the point where the thread had snapped. The pattern would be different now. It would be richer, more complex, and more true, precisely because it would contain the small, strong knot that marked the place where he had been broken and had learned to mend himself. With a final, grateful look at the old weaver, he turned his steps toward home, ready to begin. Walking through the familiar lanes of his village as twilight fell, Kaito felt the gentle weight of this new understanding. It was not a heavy burden of responsibility, but a grounding sense of agency. The metaphor of the loom had given him a tangible way to grasp the abstract teachings of the mountain. He was not a passive victim of his past. He was an active participant in the creation of his present and future. He saw the loom in everything. He saw it in the way the carpenter mended a split in a wooden beam, not by discarding it, but by fitting a new piece of wood into the gap, creating a strong and visible join. He saw it in the way the thatcher on a nearby roof was replacing a damaged section, weaving new straw into the old, making the roof whole again. The entire village was a testament to this constant process of mending, integrating, and continuing. He had been so focused on his singular, dramatic failure that he had been blind to the quiet, everyday resilience that surrounded him. As he approached his own home, a wave of apprehension washed over him, a faint echo of the old fear. His wife, Emmy, would be inside. How could he explain what had happened to him? How could he describe the lessons of a whispering stream or an empty boat to someone who had only seen his debilitating grief? He had left as a broken man, a ghost haunting his own house. Who was he now? He paused by the simple wooden gate, the familiar scent of the small herb garden by the door filling his senses. He took a deep breath, remembering the master's advice, "Be here for each step." He slid the door open. The house was quiet, filled with the warm, soft light of a single oil lamp. Emmy was sitting at the low table, mending one of his old work robes. Her head was bent in concentration, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She was weaving, in her own way. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened, first with surprise, and then with a deep, searching concern. She saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in months. The haunted, hollowed-out look was gone. The stoop in his shoulders had lessened. There was a stillness in his eyes she had not seen since before the time of the dragon's breath vase. She did not rush to him with questions or accusations. She simply put down her sewing, her gaze never leaving his face. "You are back," she said, her voice soft. "I am back," he replied, and the simple words felt true. He was not just physically present, he was back. He sat down opposite her at the table. He did not know where to begin, so he simply started with the truth. He told her about his journey, about the master, about the garden. He did not try to sound wise or enlightened. He spoke of his confusion, his anger, his slow, dawning understanding. He told her about the kintsugi teacup and how the master had honored its brokenness. And then he told her about the weaver, about the broken thread and the knot that becomes part of the fabric. As he spoke, he watched her face. He saw her concerns soften into understanding, and then into a quiet, profound relief. She, too, had been living with the broken thread. His pain had been her pain. His withdrawal had been her loneliness. When he finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her hand was warm and strong. "Your robe had a tear in it," she said, gesturing to the garment in her lap. "I was mending it. I was not trying to make the tear disappear, I was just trying to make it strong again." In that simple statement, Kaito heard the echo of everything he had learned. She understood. She had been practicing this wisdom all along, in her own quiet, practical way. His great, dramatic spiritual crisis was, in the end, no different from a simple tear in a piece of cloth that needed to be mended with patience and care. He felt a wave of love and gratitude for her quiet strength, for her unwavering presence in the face of his long absence. "The knot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It will always be there. The memory." "Then we will make it a part of the pattern," she replied, her voice firm and gentle. "A good knot is a strong knot. It will hold." In that moment, the last of the old chains seemed to fall away. His healing was not a solitary journey he had to complete on his own. It was a shared weaving. Emmy was the warp, the steady, foundational threads of his life. His experiences were the weft, and together they would weave this new cloth. The next morning, Kaito woke in his own bed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He did not go to his workshop. Instead, he walked through the village, not as a stranger this time, but as a resident returning home. He greeted his neighbors. He stopped to speak with the carpenter. He bought vegetables in the market, and he looked the woman who sold them in the eye and thanked her. He was reweaving himself into the fabric of his community, one simple, present moment interaction at a time. He was aware of the whispers, the curious glances. He knew the story of his failure was a thread in the village's tapestry as well. But it no longer felt like a source of shame. It was simply a fact, a part of his story. He did not try to hide it or explain it. He simply met the world with a quiet, open presence. He was a man with a knot in his thread, and he was not ashamed. He found that his new way of being had a subtle effect on others. His quiet presence seemed to invite a similar quietness in them. His lack of pretense, his simple, direct way of speaking seemed to put people at ease. He was no longer Kaito the master potter, a man to be looked up to and revered. Nor was he Kaito the failure, a man to be pitied. He was just Kaito, a man who had been through a difficult time and had returned with a certain stillness about him. This new identity was far more comfortable, far more real than either of the previous two. It was not a role he was playing, it was simply who he was. He was a robe that had been torn and mended, and the mended place, far from being a weakness, was now a source of a quiet, unassuming strength. The shuttle was moving again, and the fabric of his life was growing, richer and more interesting, than it had ever been before. Part 8. The Sound of One Hand. Weeks turned into a month, and Kaito settled back into the rhythm of village life, a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. He had not yet returned to his potter's wheel. The workshop remained a place of quiet stillness, but it was no longer a prison filled with ghosts. It was simply a room, waiting. He knew he would return to the clay when the time was right, but he felt no urgency. The weaving of his new life was a more pressing and delicate craft. His days were simple. He helped Emmy with the garden, finding the same meditative quality in pulling weeds and watering vegetables that he had discovered on the mountain. He repaired a section of their fence, his hands enjoying the familiar feel of the wood and tools. He spent long hours walking in the nearby bamboo forest, not seeking answers, but simply being present with the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, a sound that reminded him of the master's quiet wisdom. Yet, despite the peace he had found, a subtle disquiet began to surface. It was not the sharp, agonizing pain of his old suffering, but a more refined, intellectual puzzle. He had dismantled the stories of his failure, seen the emptiness of the self he had blamed, and begun to weave his experiences into a new fabric. But he felt there was a final layer to understand, a core question that remained unanswered. He felt like a man who had learned all the notes of a song, but had not yet heard the music. The teachings of the mountains circled in his mind. The flowing stream, the impermanent garden, the mended cup, the empty boat, the weaver's loom. They were beautiful, powerful metaphors, and they had been his guides out of the darkness. But he sensed they were all pointing toward a single, central truth that he had not yet fully grasped. He was still holding on to a subtle duality, a sense of himself as the one who was practicing, the one who was healing, the one who was understanding. There was still Kaito, and there was the world. There was still the problem, and there was the solution. One evening, as he sat on the veranda of his home, watching the full moon rise over the dark hills, a memory from his youth surfaced. It was a memory of his first teacher, the old potter who had taught him his craft. The old man had also been a student of Zen, and he would sometimes pose strange, paradoxical questions to the young Kaito as they worked. One of those questions now returned to him with a fresh and urgent significance. "You know the sound of two hands clapping," the old master had said, clapping his hands together sharply. "But what is the sound of one hand?" As a boy, Kaito had been baffled. He had tried to imagine it. A hand waving in the air, it made a faint whooshing sound. A hand slapping his own leg, that was still two things coming together. He had concluded it was a nonsensical riddle, a trick question with no answer. But now, the koan, as he later learned such questions were called, resonated with the deep unease in his own heart. He realized that his entire struggle had been a form of two-handed clapping. On one side, there was the past, the mistake, the failure, the shame. On the other side, there was his reaction, the resistance, the self-blame, the desperate effort to fix it, to overcome it, to forgive it. The two hands had been clapping together, creating the loud, discordant noise of his suffering. His entire inner world had been this violent, repetitive clapping, failure and blame, failure and blame. The teachings of the master had been a way to make the clapping softer, more mindful. He had learned to see that one hand, the failure, was an empty boat, and the other hand, his reaction, could be one of compassion. The sound had changed from a painful clash to a gentler coming together. But it was still two hands. There was still the event, and there was still his response to the event. There was still a fundamental separation. What would it mean to hear the sound of one hand? The question took root in his mind and would not let him go. It was not an intellectual puzzle to be solved with logic, but a deep, existential inquiry. He sat with it day after day. He would hold up one hand and simply look at it. What was its sound? He thought about the stream. The stream did not resist the rocks in its path. It did not have a separate self that was in conflict with the rocks. The water and the rocks were part of a single, unified process of flowing. The sound of the stream was the sound of one hand. He thought about the weaver. The weaver did not fight the broken thread. She did not see it as an enemy to be conquered. She simply integrated it. The thread and the knot and the cloth were all part of one fabric. The sound of the loom was the sound of one hand. He began to see his own mind as the source of the second hand. His mind was what created the separation. It took the raw, unified experience of life and sliced it into pieces. Good and bad, success and failure, past and present, me and you. It was the mind that created the me who had failed and the failure that had happened to me. It was the mind that created the me who was suffering and the pain that I needed to get rid of. This constant activity of judging, labeling, and separating was the second hand, always moving, always looking for something to clap against. The sound of one hand, he began to suspect, was the sound of the mind coming to rest. It was the sound of life before the mind sliced it into opposing pairs. It was the sound of simply being, without the constant commentary, without the struggle, without the conflict. He started to practice with this. When a memory of the broken vase would arise, he would not only see it as an empty boat, he would try to dissolve the very distinction between himself and the memory. He would try to experience it not as my memory of failure, but simply as an energy, a sensation, a vibration arising in the vast space of awareness. He would let the memory be what it was, without adding the second hand of his reaction to it, not even the reaction of, I must be compassionate toward this. He would simply let it be. He would become the space in which the memory arose and fell, like a sound echoing in a silent hall. This was the most difficult practice of all. It required a complete letting go of control, a radical trust in the flow of experience. It was one thing to stop blaming himself. It was another thing entirely to stop managing his experience, to stop trying to curate it into something peaceful or acceptable. One afternoon, he was sitting in his workshop. He had not touched the clay, but he had cleaned the room, sweeping away the dust, letting the sunlight and air flow through it. He sat on his simple wooden stool, his eyes closed. He held the koan in his mind. What is the sound of one hand? He listened. He listened not just with his ears, but with his whole being. He listened to the sound of his own breathing. He listened to the distant sound of the carpenter's hammer. He listened to the chirping of a sparrow outside the window. He listened to the silence between the sounds. Then, he listened to the inner world. He heard the faint, familiar echo of his shame. He felt the tightness in his chest that accompanied it. In the past, this would have been the first hand clapping. The second hand would have been his immediate reaction. There it is again, the pain. I must meet it with compassion. I must see it as an empty boat. But this time, he did something different. He did nothing. He did not move toward the feeling or away from it. He did not label it, judge it, or try to fix it. He simply allowed it to be there in its raw, unfiltered reality. He dropped the entire project of trying to heal himself. He let go of the healer and the wound. He let go of the meditator and the object of meditation. All the distinctions dissolved. And in that space of pure, non-dual awareness, something shifted. The tightness in his chest was still there, but it was no longer his tightness. The memory was still there, but it was no longer his shame. They were just energies, as impersonal as the sound of the wind. They were not clapping against anything. They were simply arising and passing away in a vast, silent space. In that moment, there was no kaito. There was no failure. There was no past. There was only this. The sound of his own breath. The warmth of the sun on his face. The simple, unadorned reality of the present moment. It was the sound of one hand. It was not a sound he could hear with his ears. It was the sound of absolute stillness, the sound of perfect unity, the sound of the conflict ending, not because one side had won, but because the two sides had realized they were, and always had been, a single entity. He did not achieve enlightenment. He did not become a great sage. But in that moment of profound insight, the final, deepest root of his suffering was pulled. He understood that his struggle for self-forgiveness had been the last and most subtle form of the conflict itself. The very act of trying to forgive implies a separation between the forgiver and the one to be forgiven. True peace was not in the act of forgiveness, but in the realization that there was nothing to forgive and no one to forgive it. There was only the unfolding of life, moment by moment. He opened his eyes. The light in the workshop seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. The old potter's wheel in the corner no longer looked like a monument to his past. It looked like a tool, an invitation. A quiet joy, pure and uncaused, bubbled up from within him. It was not the proud, excited joy of accomplishment. It was the calm, steady joy of homecoming. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that he was ready to work again. Not to reclaim his title as a master, not to prove his worth, not even to create beauty. He would return to the clay simply because that was his nature. A stream flows. A tree grows. A potter shapes clay. It was the sound of his one hand. It was the natural, effortless expression of his being, free from the noisy clapping of ambition and fear. The long argument in the boat was finally over. Not because one side had convinced the other, but because both had looked over the edge and seen that they were not in a boat at all, but were simply waves in the same single ocean. This profound, silent insight did not make Kaito's life perfect or free from difficulty. It simply changed his relationship to everything. The koan of the one hand was not a puzzle to be solved once, but a state of being to be returned to again and again. It was a new way of orienting himself in the world. He began to see the two-handed clapping everywhere, not just in his own past suffering, but in the everyday life of the village. He saw it in the arguments between neighbors over a stray chicken, each person clinging to their own story of being right, their hands clapping in a noisy display of ego. He saw it in the merchant's anxiety over a delayed shipment, his mind clapping the hand of what should be against the hand of what is, creating the painful sound of worry. He saw it in the young mother's frustration with her crying child, her desire for a peaceful moment clapping against the reality of the child's needs. He saw all this not with judgment, but with a deep, boundless compassion. He recognized the sound. He knew how exhausting, how painful that constant internal clapping could be. His own interactions began to change. Before, he had always met the world with a subtle agenda. He wanted to be seen as a master, or later, he wanted to be left alone in his shame. There was always a second hand, a sense of me trying to get something from the interaction. Now, he found he could simply be present. He could listen to a neighbor's complaint without the need to offer a solution or take a side. He could simply provide a quiet, non-judgmental space for the person to be heard. He was offering them a moment of one-handedness, a brief respite from their own inner conflict. People began to seek him out, not for advice, but for the quality of his stillness. They would sit with him, talk for a while, and leave feeling a little lighter, a little more settled, without quite knowing why. One day, his old friend, the carpenter, came to him, his face a mask of distress. His youngest son was sick with a fever that would not break, and the carpenter was consumed with fear and guilt. "Perhaps I worked him too hard," he lamented. "Perhaps I did not notice the first signs of his illness. It is my fault." The old Kaito, the one who lived in the world of two hands, might have offered reassurances, telling his friend it wasn't his fault, that he was a good father. He would have been trying to stop the clapping by force. The new Kaito simply sat with his friend, listening. He heard the sound of the two hands, the hand of a sick child and the hand of a father's self-blame, clapping together to create the painful sound of guilt. When the carpenter fell silent, exhausted by his own worry, Kaito did not offer advice. He simply said, "Your love for your son is a deep and powerful river. Right now it is crashing against the rocks of fear. Can you feel the love underneath the fear? Can you rest in the strength of that river, even as it flows through this difficult passage?" He was not trying to take away his friend's pain. He was inviting him to find the one hand within it, the pure, unconditional love for his son, a love that existed before and beyond the story of blame. The carpenter looked at him, his eyes filled with tears, and nodded slowly. A small measure of peace seemed to settle on his troubled features. Kaito had not given him an answer, but he had helped him to quiet the question. This was the true meaning of his art now. His craft was no longer just about shaping clay. It was about shaping a space of peace, both within himself and for others. The silence of the one hand was not an empty, dead silence. It was a vibrant, alive stillness, pregnant with all possibilities. It was the silence of the uncarved block of wood, the unformed lump of clay, the clear, open sky. His return to the potter's wheel was not a momentous occasion. One morning, he simply walked into the workshop, uncovered the clay, and sat down. There was no grand intention, no goal to create a masterpiece. He was not trying to prove that he had recovered his skill. He was simply a man sitting down to do the work that was his to do. He took a piece of clay, and his hands, once so filled with doubt and trembling, were steady. They moved with a familiar, intuitive grace. But something was different. Before, his hands had been instruments of his will, forcing the clay to conform to an idea in his mind. Now, his hands were listeners. They seemed to be in a silent dialogue with the clay, feeling its nature, its willingness, its limits. He was not imposing a form on the clay, he was collaborating with it, discovering the form that was waiting to emerge. The separation between potter and clay, between creator and creation, dissolved. His hands, the wheel, the clay, they were all part of a single, flowing process. There was no thought of success or failure. There was only the turning, the gentle pressure, the rising of the form. It was a meditation in motion, a perfect expression of the sound of one hand. The noisy clapping of ambition and fear had been replaced by the quiet, rhythmic hum of the wheel and the soft, whispering sound of wet clay moving through his fingers. He had found the sound of one hand not in a mountain monastery, but here, in his own dusty workshop, in the simple, humble act of his craft. He was finally, truly, home. Part 9. Mending the Earth. The hum of the potter's wheel became the new heartbeat of Kaito's life. It was a quiet, steady rhythm that emanated from his workshop, a sound of gentle, persistent creation that spread a sense of calm to those who passed by. Villagers would pause and listen, a small smile touching their lips. The sound was a signal that something had been restored, not just for the potter, but for the village itself. The silence from his workshop had been a sign of a wound. The sound of the turning wheel was the sound of healing. But the work that Kaito was now engaged in was profoundly different from his past endeavors. He was no longer interested in creating masterpieces, in pushing the boundaries of his craft to achieve a flawless, breathtaking beauty that would win him praise and recognition. The fire of that ambition had been extinguished, its ashes cooled by the waters of humility and insight. His new work was quieter, humbler, and in its own way, far more beautiful. One morning, he went to the back of his workshop, to the place where he had always thrown his failures. It was a small, overgrown patch of ground, a boneyard of his own making. For years, it had been a place of shame, a testament to every time he had fallen short of his own exacting standards. Cracked bowls, warped vases, plates with flawed glazes, they were all there, a hidden monument to his secret imperfection. At the heart of the pile, wrapped in an old cloth and tucked inside a wooden box, were the largest and most painful shards of all, the remains of the dragon's breath vase. He had not looked at them since the day he had swept them up. To do so would have been to invite the full force of his shame and despair. But now he approached the box not with dread, but with a quiet, tender curiosity. He knelt on the earth and, slowly, carefully, opened the lid. The pieces lay there, their sharp, jagged edges still holding a memory of the violent moment of their breaking. The glaze, that magnificent swirling mixture of mist and fire, still shimmered in the morning light. He saw the deep indigos, the soft greys, the fiery ambers. It was still beautiful, even in its shattered state. He felt a pang, not of his old, agonizing grief, but of a gentle, compassionate sadness for the beautiful thing that had been broken, and for the man who had been broken with it. He saw the story of his own pride and his own suffering held in these fragments. He did not try to piece the vase back together. That was not the point. The vase's life as a single, perfect object was over. Its story had changed. Following the lesson of the kintsugi cup, he knew that its brokenness was now its most essential quality. But he would not mend it with gold to be put on display. He had a different kind of mending in mind. He took a large hammer and, placing one of the shards on a flat stone, he struck it. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet morning air. He struck it again and again, breaking the larger pieces into smaller and smaller fragments, until he had a pile of glittering, sand-like grit. He did this with all the pieces, his movements steady and deliberate. This act, which would have once seemed like the ultimate desecration, a final, brutal confirmation of his failure, now felt like an act of transformation. He was not destroying the vase. He was liberating it from its old form. He was grinding his failure into dust, not to erase it, but to make it into something new. He then gathered this glittering, dark dust, the dust of the dragon's breath, the dust of his own shattered ego, and carried it back into his workshop. He took a large measure of fresh, new clay, the same dark, rich earth he had used for the original vase. He kneaded it on his bench, and as he worked, he slowly, carefully, began to mix in the ground-up shards. He was folding his past into his present. He was taking the sharpest edges of his pain and making them a part of the very substance he would now work with. The clay, once smooth and uniform, was now flecked with tiny, sharp, glittering particles of the broken vase. It had a new texture, a new character. It was no longer a perfect, virgin material. It was a clay that contained a history of brokenness and transformation. It was a mended earth. With this new clay, he began to create. He did not attempt to make another grand, ceremonial vase. His hands had no memory of that ambition. Instead, they shaped simple, humble objects. He made rice bowls, small and deep, designed to be held in two hands. He made teacups, wide and low, with a comfortable, sturdy feel. He made small plates for pickles and sauces. He made objects for daily life, for the hands of ordinary people. As he worked, he could feel the grit of the old vase under his fingers. The sharp particles resisted the smooth flow of his shaping, creating tiny imperfections and unexpected textures on the surface of the pots. An old kaito would have been infuriated by this, seeing it as a flaw, a contamination. The new kaito welcomed it. Each tiny bump, each rough patch was a reminder. It was the knot in the weaver's thread. It was the golden seam in the kintsugi cup. It was the story of his own journey, embedded in the very skin of his new creations. He was not hiding his past. He was making it the unique and defining feature of his new work. When the pieces were fired, the result was remarkable. The tiny fragments of the old glaze melted and fused with the new clay in unpredictable ways. The simple, earth-colored bowls and cups were speckled with tiny, shimmering flecks of deep blue and fiery amber. They looked as if they held a piece of the night sky, a constellation of distant stars. They were not perfect. They were not flawless. They were something more. They were imbued with a wabi-sabi beauty, a profound and quiet elegance that celebrated imperfection, impermanence, and the authentic story of their own making. He did not sell these new pieces. He gave them away. He took a set of bowls to the carpenter and his family, whose son was now healthy and strong again. He gave a set of teacups to Hannah, the old weaver, who received them with a knowing smile. He gave a bowl to the woman in the market, to the village elder, to the young mother with the crying child. Each time he gave a piece away, it was a silent act of gratitude, a sharing of his own mended heart. He was returning the kindness that had been offered to him, not with words, but through the work of his hands. The villagers who received these bowls felt their special quality. They were sturdy and felt good in the hand, but there was more to them than that. When they held the bowls up to the light, they would see the tiny, star-like flecks, and they would feel a sense of deep, quiet peace. The bowls seemed to hold more than just rice or tea. They seemed to hold a story of resilience, a quiet reminder that even that which is broken can be transformed into something beautiful and useful. Kaito's failure, once a source of private shame, had become a shared gift, a source of communal strength and beauty. His act of mending the earth was also an act of mending his relationship with his own craft. He had once used his skill to feed his ego, to build a monument to himself. Now he used it as an act of service, of connection, of love. The joy he found in his work now was not the sharp, fleeting pleasure of praise, but the deep, abiding satisfaction of contribution. He was no longer a master, standing above others. He was simply a potter, a member of the community, using his hands to bring a little more warmth, a little more beauty, a little more peace into the daily lives of his neighbors. He thought of the master on the mountain. Jiro did not create grand works of art. He tended a garden, he washed his bowl, he listened. His life was his art, a seamless expression of his deep understanding. Kaito saw that his own pottery was becoming the same. It was no longer a separate activity he did to achieve a result. It was a natural extension of his own being, a way of expressing the silence of the one hand. Each bowl was a koan. It asked, what is beauty? What is perfection? What is the value of a broken thing? And in its simple, humble, glittering presence, it offered an answer that went deeper than words. His workshop was no longer a place of anxious striving. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary of mindful work. He had not just mended the earth of the clay, he had mended the very ground of his own existence, transforming the barren soil of his despair into a fertile field from which these simple, beautiful, and deeply compassionate objects could grow. He had found his true masterpiece, not in a single, flawless vase, but in the continuous, humble, and healing act of creation itself. The act of giving away his work, with no thought of payment or praise, fundamentally rewired Kaito's understanding of value. In his old life, the value of a piece was determined by its technical perfection, the rarity of its glaze, and the price a wealthy patron was willing to pay. It was an external, market-driven value. Now he was discovering a different economy, an economy of the heart. The value of these new bowls was in the connection they created, the quiet joy they brought to a simple, daily ritual. A bowl was not just an object, it was a vessel for relationship. One day, a young boy, the same one who had once asked him to make a sparrow out of mud, came to his workshop. He stood shyly in the doorway, holding a small, chipped cup. It was one of Kaito's old, mass-produced pieces, the kind he used to make quickly to sell to travelers. a piece he had never given a second thought. "Master Kaito," the boy said, his voice small, "my mother's favorite cup. It fell and broke." He held out the two pieces, his eyes full of worry. The old Kaito would have dismissed it as a worthless piece, offering to replace it with a new one. But the man who had learned the lesson of kintsugi saw something else. He saw the value the cup held for the boy and his mother, a value that had nothing to do with its quality or price. It was a value created by use, by memory, by love. "Let me see," Kaito said gently, taking the pieces from the boy. "A thing that is loved is never worthless. Let us see if we can mend it." He did not use gold. That was not what this cup needed. He carefully prepared a lacquer mixed with simple rice flour, a traditional, strong adhesive. He meticulously applied it to the broken edges and fitted the two pieces together, holding them with steady pressure until the bond took hold. He then filled the remaining hairline crack with a lacquer colored with a bit of reddish earth, creating a simple, honest seam. Did not try to hide the repair. It was a humble kintsugi, a mending done not with precious metal, but with patient care. When he gave the mended cup back to the boy, the child's face lit up with a joy more profound than any praise a wealthy lord could have offered. "Thank you," he whispered, holding the cup as if it were a treasure. Kaito watched him run off and understood that this, too, was his work now. Mending, not just creating new things from the dust of the old, but also honoring and repairing the simple, beloved objects that were already woven into the fabric of people's lives. His workshop was becoming a place of restoration in every sense. He was not just a potter, he was a mender of things, a keeper of stories. This new way of working had a profound effect on his skill. Freed from the anxiety of perfection, his hands became more intuitive, more expressive. The forms he created were simpler, but they had a life and a warmth that his technically perfect pieces had often lacked. He was no longer trying to control the clay, to force it into a preconceived ideal. He was listening to it, allowing its own nature to guide his hands. He discovered that the clay had its own wisdom. Sometimes a bowl wanted to be a little asymmetrical. Sometimes a glaze wanted to run in a way he hadn't planned. He learned to embrace these accidents, these moments of serendipity, as collaborations with the material itself. His work became less about his own skill and more about the beauty of the natural process. He began to experiment with local materials he had previously disdained as too common. He made a glaze from the ash of rice straw from a neighbor's field, which produced a soft, milky white, full of subtle crazing. He mixed local iron-rich sand into his clay, which created a warm, reddish-brown body with a rough, honest texture. His work became a reflection of the place where he lived, a true expression of the local earth. He was no longer trying to create a transcendent object that stood apart from the world. He was creating objects that were deeply, beautifully rooted in it. His relationship with failure was completely transformed. It was no longer a catastrophe to be avoided at all costs. It was simply information. When a piece cracked in the kiln, he would study the crack, trying to understand what it was telling him about the clay, the heat, the form. The crack was not a judgment on his worth. It was a teacher. He would then take the broken pieces and grind them down, adding them to his growing supply of mended earth. Every failure, every mistake was literally recycled back into the body of his new work. His art became a living testament to the idea that nothing is ever wasted, that every experience, no matter how painful, can become a source of strength and character. The villagers saw the change in him, and they saw the profound change in his work. They no longer spoke of him as a master, a title that now seemed hollow and distant. They called him our potter, a term of affection and belonging. They felt that his work was a part of them, and they were a part of it. The bowls they ate from were made from the same earth they walked on, glazed with the ash of the rice they grew, and embedded with the story of a man they all knew and respected, a man who had faced his own brokenness and had found a way to transform it into a gift for them all. Kaito had, in the end, created his masterpiece. It was not a single, magnificent vase. It was a living, breathing body of work, a community of humble objects that radiated a quiet, resilient beauty. And more than that, his masterpiece was his own life, a life that had been shattered and then remade, not into its original form, but into something stronger, more compassionate, and infinitely more true. He had learned to mend the earth, and in doing so, he had mended himself. The sound from his workshop was no longer just the hum of a wheel. It was the sound of a whole and integrated life, a quiet, steady song of peace. Part 10. The Moon in the Water. The seasons turned, and the quiet rhythm of Kaito's life flowed on, as steady and constant as the stream on the mountain. His workshop was a place of gentle, mindful work, his home a place of shared peace with Emi, and the village a community to which he was deeply and gratefully connected. The sharp, painful edges of his past had been worn smooth, not by time, but by the persistent, gentle friction of his daily practice. The story of the dragon's breath vase was no longer a ghost that haunted him, but a distant ancestor, a part of his lineage whose lessons were now integrated into the very marrow of his being. He had not seen Master Jiro since the day he had walked down the mountain, but the Master's presence was a constant companion. It was there in the way he paused to watch a cloud pass, in the gratitude he felt as he ate his simple bowl of rice, in the quiet compassion that arose in his heart when he saw suffering in others. The teachings were not memories, they were a living, breathing part of him, as natural as his own heartbeat. One evening, in the deep calm of a late autumn night, Kaito felt a quiet pull to walk. The air was perfectly still, the sky a vast, clear dome of indigo velvet, strewn with the diamond dust of 1,000 stars. A full moon, luminous and serene, hung in the sky like a perfect celestial lantern, bathing the sleeping village in a soft, ethereal, silver light. He walked through the silent lanes, his footsteps the only sound, until he found himself on the path that led down to the small lake just beyond the village. The lake was a place he had avoided for a long time. In the depths of his despair, its still, reflective surface had seemed to mock him, showing him only the reflection of his own sorrowful face. But tonight, he felt no such aversion. He was drawn to its stillness. He came to the water's edge and stood there, breathing in the cool, clean air. The surface of the lake was like a sheet of polished black lacquer, so perfectly still it was almost invisible. And there, held in its dark, silent embrace, was the moon. It was not a wavering, distorted image, but a perfect, luminous reflection, as clear and bright as the moon in the sky above. It was so real, so present, he felt he could almost reach in and touch it. He sat down on a smooth, mossy rock at the water's edge, the same rock where he had sat as a boy, dreaming of the perfect vases he would one day create. He looked at the two moons, the one in the heavens, distant, untouchable, and the one in the water, immediate, intimate, seemingly within his grasp. And in the profound silence of that moment, the final, deepest layer of the Master's teachings unfolded within him, not as a thought, but as a direct, undeniable experience. His true nature, his Buddha nature, as the Master might have called it, was the moon in the sky. It was pristine, complete, and utterly unaffected by the turmoil of the world. It was the vast, silent awareness that had been with him his entire life, before he was a potter, before his success, before his failure. It was the sky-like mind, the boundless space in which all experiences arise and fall. His life, his personality, his story, all of it was the reflection of the moon in the water. It was a beautiful but transient image, His successes had been moments when the water was calm and the reflection was clear and bright. He had mistaken this clear reflection for his true self, and he had become proud. His failure, the shattering of the vase, had been like a stone thrown into the lake. The water had been thrown into violent turmoil, and the reflection of the moon had been shattered into 1,000 distorted, shimmering fragments. He had mistaken these broken fragments for his true self, and he had fallen into despair. All his suffering had come from this fundamental confusion. He had been living his life completely identified with the reflection in the water, rising and falling with its every ripple, celebrating its moments of clarity and lamenting its moments of disturbance. He had spent months trying to calm the water, to fix the reflection, to mend the broken image of the moon. But now, sitting in the deep stillness of the night, he saw the truth with absolute clarity. The real moon, the moon in the sky, had never been disturbed. It had remained perfectly whole, perfectly serene, shining with a constant, unwavering light, regardless of the state of the water below. The storm on the lake's surface had not touched the moon in the sky. His own inner storm of pride, shame, and despair had not touched his true nature. It had only ever disturbed the reflection. A gentle breeze whispered across the lake, and the surface of the water shivered. The reflected moon dissolved into a cascade of silver light, 1,000 dancing ripples. Kaito watched, and he did not feel a moment's anxiety or sense of loss. He knew that the real moon was still there, serene and untouched, in the sky above. And he knew that when the breeze passed and the water grew still again, the reflection would return, perfect and whole. This was the ultimate self-forgiveness. It was the realization that the self he had been trying to forgive, the flawed, broken, imperfect self reflected in the water of his life, was not his true self. It was an image, a story, a reflection. His true self, the silent, aware presence that was watching the reflection, had never been broken. It needed no forgiveness. It was, and always had been, whole. He thought of the Kintsugi cup. It was a beautiful, powerful teaching for the world of reflections, a way to mend the broken image with the gold of compassion. He thought of the empty boat. It was a way to understand that the disturbances on the water were impersonal events, not malicious attacks on the reflection. He thought of the weaver's loom. It was a way to actively and creatively weave a new and more resilient pattern into the reflection. All of these teachings were skillful means, compassionate guides for navigating the turbulent waters of human life. But this direct seeing of the two moons was the final destination. It was the end of the journey, because it was the realization that he had never left home. His true nature had always been here, shining peacefully, waiting for him to look up from the troubled waters and recognize it. He closed his eyes, but the image of the moon remained, shining brightly in the inner sky of his mind. He felt a sense of peace so profound, so complete, that it was beyond all words. It was not the peace of a quiet mind, but the peace of his true nature, the peace that underlies all experience, both stormy and calm. It was the peace of the moon, shining in the silent, empty sky. He did not know how long he sat there. Time seemed to dissolve. The boundary between himself and the world, between the observer and the observed, melted away. There was only the stillness, the soft moonlight, the gentle breath of the night air. He was the rock, he was the water, he was the moon. He was the silent, witnessing presence in which all of these things appeared. When he finally opened his eyes, the moon had tracked across the sky, and the first, faint hint of dawn was beginning to soften the eastern horizon. He stood up, his body feeling light and free. He bowed deeply to the lake, to the moon, to the coming dawn. He was bowing to the great, silent mystery of which he was an inseparable part. He walked back to his home, his heart as calm and clear as the surface of the lake. He knew that the waters of his life would not always be still. There would be other winds, other stones, other storms. The reflection would be disturbed again. There would be moments of joy, of sadness, of confusion, of anger. But he would never again mistake the reflection for the reality. He would always remember the moon in the sky. He would carry its silent, serene light within him, a constant, unwavering source of peace. He slid open the door to his home. Emmy was asleep, her breathing soft and regular. He looked at her, and his heart filled with a quiet, boundless love. He was home. He was a simple potter, a husband, a villager. He was a man who had been broken and had found a way to be whole again. Not by fixing the broken pieces, but by discovering the wholeness that had never been broken. He sat on his mat, and as the sun began to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the world, he closed his eyes. He did not need to meditate. He did not need to practice. His life was now the practice. His every breath was the meditation. He simply rested in the quiet, luminous peace of his own true nature, as the moon rests in the silent, empty sky. The journey was over. He was at peace, and in that deep, abiding peace, he was ready for whatever the new day might bring. As the days unfolded into weeks, and weeks into another turning of the years, this quiet, moon-like understanding became the ground of Kaito's life. It was not a dramatic, ever-present state of bliss, but a subtle, underlying current of peace that informed everything he did. The ordinary world did not change. The rains still came, the winter was still cold, the villagers still gossiped, and pots still sometimes cracked in the heat of the kiln. The surface of the lake was rarely perfectly still, but Kaito's relationship to the ripples had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered. He found that this deep, quiet knowing allowed him to meet the world with a new kind of grace and humor. When his old friend the carpenter would grumble about a crooked piece of wood, Kaito would smile. He saw the carpenter's frustration as a small stone tossed into the water, creating a brief, agitated ripple in the reflection. He no longer felt the need to calm the water for his friend, but could simply sit with him in a companionable silence, his own stillness, a quiet invitation for his friend's waters to settle on their own. His art continued to evolve. He became known throughout the province not for grand, perfect creations, but for his moon bowls. These were simple, humble rice bowls made from his mended earth, the clay flecked with the dust of his past. But the genius was in the glaze. On the inside of each bowl, at the very bottom, he would paint a single, perfect circle of white glaze. When the bowl was filled with tea or a dark broth, the circle would seem to float in the liquid, a luminous, perfect moon suspended in a dark sky. People were drawn to these bowls. They said that eating from them was a form of meditation. As they would finish their meal, the small white moon would be revealed, a quiet reminder of the stillness that lies at the bottom of all things. The bowls were not just objects of beauty, they were objects of teaching. They were a daily, tangible reminder of the two moons. They held the story of Kaito's journey, a story of shattering and mending, of turmoil and peace, and they offered it as a quiet gift to anyone who held them. Travelers and monks would sometimes seek him out, having heard of the wise potter who lived in the small village. They would come expecting to find a master who would dispense profound, esoteric wisdom. They would find instead a simple man with earth under his fingernails, a man who would greet them with a quiet smile and a cup of tea served in a simple, flecked cup. One such visitor was a young, earnest monk, his face tight with the strain of his spiritual striving. "Master," the monk said, his voice full of a desperate intensity, "I have been meditating for years. I have studied the sutras. I have wrestled with the koans, but I cannot find peace. My mind is a storm of thoughts. How do I calm the waters?" Kaito listened, his heart full of compassion for the young man's struggle. He recognized the sound of the two hands clapping, the violent struggle of the self trying to subdue the self. He did not offer a lecture or a complex philosophical answer. Instead, he poured the monk another cup of tea. "The water in your cup is still," he said simply. "Drink your tea." The monk, confused, looked down at his cup. The dark liquid was indeed still, and in its surface he could see a tiny, distorted reflection of his own face. He drank the tea. "Your mind is like a lake," Kaito continued, his voice as gentle as the steam rising from the kettle. "You are trying to calm it by beating the waves with a stick. You are adding more disturbance in your effort to find peace. You believe you are the waves, and so you are terrified of the storm." He paused, and then looked the young monk directly in the eye. "You are not the waves," he said softly. "You are the sky that holds the lake. The storm cannot touch the sky. Stop trying to fix the water. Just look up." The young monk sat in stunned silence, the simple words echoing in the chamber of his heart. Kaito said no more. He simply sat with him, a silent, peaceful presence. After a long time, the tension in the monk's face began to soften. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He bowed low to Kaito, a bow of profound, wordless gratitude, and left. Kaito knew he had not given the monk peace. He had simply pointed him toward the peace that was already, and always had been, his own. As Kaito grew older, his movements became slower, more deliberate. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and his face became a beautiful, intricate map of his long life. He continued his work at the wheel, his hands, though wrinkled and gnarled, as steady and sensitive as ever. His final years were his most creative. He had let go of every last vestige of technique and intention, and his work became a pure, direct expression of his spirit. The bowls and cups he made seemed almost to have formed themselves, possessing a natural, unforced beauty that was breathtaking in its simplicity. One clear, cold winter's night, when the moon was full and the world was blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, Kaito knew his time was coming to an end. He felt no fear, no regret. His life felt complete, a circle as perfect and whole as the white moon on the bottom of his bowls. He sat with Emmy, holding her hand, their life together, a long, beautiful weaving of shared silence and deep, unspoken understanding. He thought of his journey. He saw the proud young potter, so full of ambition. He saw the broken man, lost in a forest of shame. He saw the seeker, climbing a mountain in desperation. He saw the student, listening to the stream. He saw the gardener, learning the lesson of the withered flower. He saw the mender, applying the gold of compassion to his own wounds. He saw the weaver, integrating the broken thread. He saw the man sitting by the lake, discovering the moon that had always been there. He saw that all these figures, all these stages, were just ripples on the water, reflections of the moon in different states of clarity and disturbance. None of them had been his true self, but all of them had been a necessary part of the journey of the reflection back to an understanding of its source. The shattering of the vase had not been a curse, it had been a gift. It had been the stone thrown into the water, the violent disturbance that had forced him to finally look up. His final breath was a quiet, gentle release, as soft and natural as a snowflake landing on the still surface of the lake. He was gone, and yet he was everywhere. He was in the bowls that nourished the villagers. He was in the quiet wisdom he had shared. He was in the memory of his gentle presence. He had dissolved back into the great, silent wholeness from which he had come. The story of Kaito the potter became a quiet legend in the village, passed down from generation to generation. It was a story told not to celebrate a great artist, but as a teaching, a guide. It was a story about the beauty of imperfection, the strength found in vulnerability, and the profound peace that comes from realizing that our true nature is never, ever broken. And sometimes, on a clear, still night, a person from the village would walk down to the lake and sit by the water's edge. They would look at the perfect moon in the sky, and they would look at its perfect reflection in the water. And in that deep, silent communion, they would touch the same timeless peace that the potter had found. They would understand that their own troubled lives, their own joys and sorrows, their own successes and failures were just ripples on the surface. And they would remember to look up, to the vast, serene, and ever-present moon, the silent, shining truth of their own heart.